This is it! The ultimate dimension for restin' stories, and it's called Sleepy Myths.
The night in the prison was not dark. It was quiet in a way that made the stars sound like they were dripping. Rick lay on the narrow metal bed, staring at the ceiling above him. From one broken pipe, a slow bead of plasma fell, glowing faintly blue before touching the ground. Each drop made a sound softer than thought. Plink, plink. It reminded him of home, of his garage. The hum of machines, the steady rhythm that always filled the silence between universes. The cell was small, but in the quiet it felt endless. Rick counted the drops, not as a way to mark time, but as a way to stay tethered to something that wasn't guilt. 1, 2, 3. Somewhere between 50 and 70, his mind began to drift. The walls melted into old memories. His hand twitched as though reaching for a wrench that wasn't there. He remembered the way the light fell in his garage, warm and golden, spilling over scattered inventions. Morty's laughter echoing faintly in the corner. The hum of the portal gun charging. The smell of coffee and burnt metal. Home. Rick closed his eyes, and for a second he could almost hear it again. The soft buzz of life, the world he built for himself through wires and chaos. But here in the prison the silence pressed against him. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of distance. The kind that sits heavy between people who care too much to speak. He sighed. So yes, this is what happens when you think too much, he muttered to no one. His voice bounced off the steel walls and came back quieter, like even it was tired of hearing him talk. Somewhere beyond the bars, the galaxy turned in slow motion. From his cell window, barely the size of a fist, he could see faint lines of light streaking across the black. They weren't stars, not really. Probably ships, debris, distant reflections. But Rick liked pretending they were stars. Stars were simpler. They burned, they faded, they didn't apologize. He reached into his coat pocket and found a piece of metal, smooth and cold. Just a scrap from some earlier attempt to build a key out of nothing. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the edges, tracing circles with his thumb. There was something almost comforting about it. Maybe it was the way it caught the faint light, glimmering like a promise that never quite broke. It had been days since he'd spoken to anyone. The guards came and went, wordless, mechanical. The hum of the walls kept him company. In the stillness, Rick began talking to himself again, not in madness, but in memory. Morty, he whispered, testing the sound of the name. It hurt, but not in the way he expected. It was a soft kind of ache, the kind that reminded him he was still capable of missing someone. He thought about the last time he saw them, his family, before this. The way Beth had looked at him, that half-second between love and exhaustion. The way Morty had hesitated, like he wanted to say something that could fix it all but didn't know how. And then he was gone. The memory folded over itself like paper. The drip from the ceiling grew slower, quieter. The air shimmered faintly, as though the light was pulsing with his thoughts. Rick stared up, and for a brief moment he imagined the drops were stars falling through the cracks of the universe, each one carrying a story he'd forgotten to tell. Maybe one of them was his. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm guide him. Plink, plink. The sound was almost like music now, steady and patient. He began humming quietly at first, a low tune that had no name. It rose from somewhere deep inside him, from a time before regret, before he believed in the idea of running away. It sounded like something a father might hum to a child to make them sleep. Rick stopped humming and chuckled under his breath. Huh? Didn't know I still had that in me. The cell's faint blue light flickered. Somewhere beyond the wall, a machine exhaled steam. The air grew thick with warmth for a moment, as if the entire place was listening to him breathe. He leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. If I ever get out of here, he said softly, I'll probably ruin it all again. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling, where the drops of plasma continued to fall. But maybe I'll try not to. He watched one drop fall perfectly onto another, merging into a small glowing puddle. The reflection shimmered, a shape forming for only an instant before fading. It looked like a family, hand in hand. Rick blinked. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it was the fatigue. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. A reminder that love doesn't vanish, even when you think you've outsmarted it. He sat up slightly and whispered to the air, Hey, Morty, you better be keeping up with your homework. "You little idiot." He smiled faintly. "And tell your mom." "Tell her He stopped. The words didn't finish, but maybe they didn't have to. Some things are meant to be felt, not said. The drops continued. The stars, or whatever they were, kept falling outside his window. Somewhere deep in the hum of the prison, a faint vibration joined the rhythm like a heartbeat syncing with his own. Rick closed his eyes again. He pictured his garage cluttered, messy, alive. He imagined Morty walking in eyes wide, asking too many questions. He imagined himself pretending to be annoyed, even though he secretly loved those moments. He imagined home. And for the first time since he'd been locked away, he didn't feel trapped. The cell walls, once cold and narrow, now felt like a cocoon. The dripping stars above him glowed brighter, softer, until they blurred into one constant light. He whispered to himself, "Guess the universe still remembers me." Then he fell silent, letting the rhythm of the stars and his heartbeat merge into one steady sound. The world outside kept spinning. The galaxy kept breathing. And somewhere in another place or another dream, a boy named Morty stirred in his sleep, hearing the faint echo of that hum across the void. The drop fell again. Plink. And with that sound, the night carried on, patient, infinite, and softly kind. The hum of the cell deepened into a rhythm that wasn't quite mechanical, not quite alive. Somewhere in the dark a droplet fell, then another, steady, unhurried. Rick sat against the cold wall, his eyes half open, the faint blue light from the ceiling tracing a slow line across his face. Every sound in that room had meaning if he let it. Every drop of plasma was a reminder of something he'd forgotten how to feel. He used to think memory was a curse, a loop that played over and over until you stopped caring what came next. But that night, sitting alone, something shifted. The silence between the drips began to hum, like static tuned to an old frequency. Rick closed his eyes, and for a moment, the cell wasn't metal anymore. It was warmth. It was his garage. In his mind, the air smelled faintly of oil and solder, that comforting blend of creation and decay. The table was cluttered the same way it always was, broken portal gun parts, wires that had names only he remembered, and a half-empty flask beside a piece of toast. Morty's voice echoed faintly somewhere behind him. Not real, but clear enough to make him smile. "Come on, Rick, you said this one wasn't dangerous." He could almost hear the way Morty's feet shuffled when he was nervous, the way he half-whispered like the universe might overhear. Rick chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, kid." "Sure I did." The memory flickered, a bright, then gone. Another drop fell. The loop began again. He'd once built machines not to escape, but to connect, to reach something that words couldn't. Each circuit, each equation was an apology in disguise. But somewhere along the line, the purpose blurred. He started creating to avoid feeling, not to understand it. Inventions became walls instead of bridges. Now, trapped in silence, the old echoes returned, not to haunt, but to remind. The cell had become a mirror, showing him everything he'd avoided seeing in the glow of neon experiments and interdimensional noise. Rick leaned back, exhaling softly. He began to count the drops again. 1, 2, 3. Each one fell into the same small puddle, rippling outward like time itself. And with each ripple came another memory. The first one was of Beth, small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. She was drawing on his old schematics, scribbling suns and hearts over quantum symbols. He'd pretended to be annoyed, but he'd kept the paper. Somewhere buried under junk and time, it still existed. Then came another. Morty's laugh during their first trip to another dimension. It wasn't the sound of fear, not that time. It was joy. The kind that only happens when you forget to be afraid. And then Unity's face. The kind of memory that hurt quietly, like a song you loved but couldn't sing anymore. The light above him flickered, and for a moment, the cell's hum matched the tone of his garage's generator back home. The illusion was perfect. He could almost feel the soft buzz of life returning to the machines, the air vibrating with invention, with purpose. But the illusion was fragile. The hum faltered, and the cold crept back in. Rick opened his eyes. The cell was just a cell again, he sighed. Figures, he muttered. Still the feeling lingered, and that small, persistent warmth that refused to fade, no matter how much cynicism he layered over it. He stood slowly, joints cracking, and approached the small puddle beneath the dripping pipe. The plasma was faintly luminescent, shimmering with soft pink light. He crouched and touched it with a finger. For a second, the reflection wasn't his face. It was Morty's, laughing, alive. The sound of that laughter stayed in his head. It wasn't a memory this time. It was something else, something new. Rick realized he wasn't remembering anymore. He was listening. The cell itself seemed to carry fragments of old sound, as if the walls had been absorbing his thoughts all along. He wondered if he'd built this place somehow. To prison shaped like regret. The loop continued, drops falling, light flickering, breath steady. But it didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like rhythm. Like the beginning of a song he'd forgotten the words to. He thought about all the things he'd never said out loud. The times he'd chosen sarcasm instead of softness, science instead of stillness. It wasn't pride that had kept him quiet, and it was fear. The fear that if he stopped moving, the universe would catch up and swallow him whole. But here, in stillness, nothing swallowed him. Nothing attacked. The silence was kind. Rick smiled faintly. "Guess stillness ain't so bad," he whispered. Another drop fell. This one landed on his hand. It was warmer than the others. He looked up. The ceiling lights blurred, almost like distant stars through fog. The more he stared, the less they looked like prison lamps and more like constellations forming above him. His breathing slowed. For a brief moment, the edges of his mind softened. He imagined being back in the garage, tinkering, while Morty napped on the couch, a cartoon playing quietly in the background. He imagined the smell of coffee and the hum of comfort in a home that never asked him to explain himself. He could stay here, inside the loop, forever. And maybe that was okay. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, the hum changed again. It became something closer to a heartbeat. He couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. Maybe Morty's, maybe the universe's. It didn't matter. He whispered into the dim air, barely audible, "Don't forget me, kid." No answer came. Just the steady drip of light. But this time it didn't sound lonely. Here it sounded patient. Rick closed his eyes. The cell faded, and for the first time in what felt like centuries he let himself rest, not from exhaustion but from memory. The loop continued without him, gently, like a song that no longer needed its composer to exist. Somewhere far away, Morty stirred in his sleep, his lips forming a name he couldn't remember upon waking. The same name that echoed quietly inside the cell, where a scientist slept beneath dripping stars. And in that infinite pause between sound and silence, the loop folded into itself, soft, endless, forgiving. The memory became light, the light became peace, and Rick, surrounded by both, simply breathed. The nights in the cell had no clear beginning or end. There was only the slow turning of thought, the hush between drops of plasma, and the steady breath of a man who had stopped fighting time. Rick lay flat on the cold floor, staring at the faint reflection of his own outline in the puddle beside him. The reflection blinked when he did. It looked tired, but there was something else there now, a glimmer, a softness that hadn't existed before. He was beginning to accept the silence. He'd stopped talking to himself, stopped calculating escape vectors that always looped back into infinity. There was nothing to solve here, nothing to fix. The cell didn't care about equations, but silence is never truly empty. It began one night when he heard the faintest sound behind the wall, a whisper threaded through the steady hum of machinery. At first he dismissed it as a trick of exhaustion. He'd heard stranger things in stranger places, but the sound persisted, brushing lightly against the edge of his thoughts like the murmur of an old dream. "Rick," he froze. The voice wasn't clear, not human, but familiar. It slid through the vent above him, carried on a faint current of air. It wasn't a guard. Their voices were rough, metallic, routine. This was something else, softer, hesitant. "You're not..." "Forgotten." Rick sat up slowly, his back cracking against the wall. He squinted toward the ceiling. The vent was small, half-rusted, a square of shadow in a sea of dull metal. "All right," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Either I've finally lost it, or they've started piping voices into the ventilation to keep me docile." But the voice came again, this time lower, tender. "No, Rick. It's me." For a heartbeat he thought it really was Morty. The tone was right, that anxious, wavering sincerity that Morty never quite grew out of. But there was something impossible about it. Like the sound came not from air but memory itself. He stood, brushed off his coat and stepped closer to the vent. The light above him flickered once, washing the cell in a faint, dreamlike glow. "If you're who I think you are," he whispered, "you're not supposed to be here." Silence. Then softly, "I never really left." He stared upward, half angry, half afraid. "So you're just a recording," he muttered, "or my brain's way of giving me something to argue with." But the voice only sighed, a long, tired sound. "You built this place, Rick, every wall, every vent, every sound. You made it so you could hear what you wouldn't let yourself say." Rick froze. The sentence hit deeper than it should have. He wanted to laugh, to dismiss it, but his throat tightened instead. He pressed his palm against the cold wall. "So what am I supposed to do, huh? Ask forgiveness from a ventilation system?" "No," the voice replied gently. "Just listen." The hum deepened. The air felt thicker, warmer. Somewhere in the corner of his mind he saw flashes, faint golden shapes moving like fireflies behind his eyelids. Morty's face smiling awkwardly. Beth's eyes when she was little. The sound of Summer playing with a gadget she wasn't supposed to touch. It was all there inside the sound. Rick backed away slowly and sat on the floor again. He didn't speak for a long time. He just listened. The vent's soft current shifted. Sometimes it was a whisper, sometimes a breeze. Each time it carried fragments of voices, familiar, tender, haunting. "Hey, Rick, you remember that time? Dad, you said you'd be back before dinner. Rick, you don't have to fix everything." He pressed his hands against his ears, trembling. "Stop," he whispered. "Just stop." But the voices didn't stop. They grew quieter, yes, but gentler too. Less like noise, more like forgiveness. Rick leaned back against the wall, breathing hard. His eyes burned, though he couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or something else. He didn't cry. He never cried. But his chest ached in a way equations couldn't solve. He spoke softly, mostly to himself. "If this is you, Morty, or whoever you are, you can't keep talking like that. You'll make me care again." The vent hummed. The voice replied, almost smiling. "Maybe that's the point." He exhaled shakily, staring up at the faint starlight leaking through the metal slats. "Care gets you hurt," he muttered. "That's the one constant I ever proved. Then prove it wrong." The answer was so simple, so absurd, that it made him laugh. The sound echoed in the small cell, awkward and human. "Oh, you really are, Morty," he said softly. Only he'd think emotions are a theorem. The voice didn't answer after that. The air grew still again. But the silence was different now. Not empty, but full. Rick leaned back and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. The voice had stirred something inside him that felt older than thought, older than science. A small piece of hope, buried deep under cynicism and regret. He found himself whispering without meaning to, his words barely touching the air. "If you're real, kid?" Thanks, no response came. Only the soft rhythm of the vent breathing in time with him. He closed his eyes. And in the dark, he imagined that somewhere, maybe across galaxies, maybe across dreams, Morty was hearing him too. Maybe the same vent ran through every version of the universe. Maybe this whisper was just their way of reaching each other through the cracks of time. Rick smiled faintly at the thought. "I guess even geniuses need an audience," he murmured. The drip of plasma started again, steady and slow. He counted 1, 2, 3, but now it wasn't just sound. It was music. The vent's breath, the plasma's fall, his own heartbeat, all part of the same quiet composition. He tilted his head back, staring at the stars painted across his mind. They pulsed softly like distant memories breathing in unison. He didn't know if the voice would return. Maybe it never left. Maybe it had always been him, talking to himself through the long corridors of regret and invention. But it didn't matter anymore. The silence had changed shape. For the first time in his life, Rick didn't feel like escaping. He whispered into the air one last time, barely audible, like a secret between worlds. "Keep talking. Morty, I'll keep listening." And somewhere, faintly, maybe through the vent, maybe through memory, a quiet voice answered. Half asleep, half hopeful. "Okay, Rick." Then the cell went still again. Only the hum remained. But this time it sounded like home. Morty hadn't been sleeping much, not since the night Rick disappeared. His dreams had turned strange, heavy, quiet things that felt like half memories, half signals. When he did manage to rest, the world inside his mind didn't feel like a dream at all. It felt like a place waiting for him. That night, the rain outside his window was slow and gentle, tapping against the glass like fingertips. The house was dark, humming faintly with the sounds of night. The clock in the hallway, the low static of the portal gun recharger, the almost whisper of the cosmos lingering in the corners of the garage. Morty's body lay still under his blanket, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. In his dream, he stood barefoot in a long corridor made of glass. The air was weightless like being underwater. Rows of cells lined both sides, stretching out endlessly into blue mist. Each one shimmered faintly, reflecting fragments of light that fell from nowhere. He walked slowly, hands trembling. He could see faint shapes behind the glass, shadows of people, versions of himself, reflections of Rick, each locked in their own world. Some were older, some younger. Some looked peaceful. Others looked broken. "Rick?" he called softly, his voice echoing down the corridor. No answer, only the echo of his own voice bending strangely in the distance. He took another step, then another. His reflection followed him, lagging half a second behind, as if reality itself had grown tired. He found a cell with a familiar figure inside, white hair, hunched posture, lab coat stained with time. Rick, or at least a version of him. The old man sat in a pool of dim light, staring down at something in his hands. A flask, maybe, or just emptiness. Morty pressed his palms against the glass. "Rick, it's me, it's Morty." Rick didn't move, didn't look up. The world around him shimmered as if underwater. "Come on, man," Morty whispered, his throat tight. "You can't just sit there." But the Rick inside the cell didn't respond. His face flickered, glitching in and out, like a memory being rewritten. Morty's reflection warped too, stretching, bending. He stumbled back. The glass pulsed like a heartbeat. From far away, a voice spoke, faint, gentle, and familiar. "Morty!" He froze. "Rick!" The sound came again, closer this time. "You can't open the door from there." He turned, but the corridor was empty. Only shifting reflections of himself and the light that dripped from above like slow tears. "Then how do I get to you?" Morty whispered. "You don't," the voice said softly. "You just have to remember me, right?" The words made no sense, and yet they did. They landed somewhere deep where logic couldn't touch. Morty closed his eyes, breathing carefully. When he opened them again, the cell was gone. So was the corridor. He was standing in a vast field under a dark violet sky. The stars hung low and too low, dripping light like dew. Each one left a trail of gentle fire that sank into the grass. He could hear the wind, slow and rhythmic, like the universe breathing. And there, far ahead, stood Rick. Not trapped. Not broken. Just standing, hands in pockets, watching the stars fall. Morty ran. The grass brushed against his legs like whispers, soft and electric. "Rick!" he shouted. "Rick, wait!" Rick turned slightly, but his expression was unreadable, calm, sad. "Hey, Morty," he said. His voice was slow, quieter than usual. "You made it further than I thought. What does that mean?" Morty stammered, breathless. "Where are we? Is this a dream? Are you okay?" Rick looked up at the stars as if trying to remember their names. "Doesn't matter what it is. You're here, that's enough." Morty felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're stuck somewhere, aren't you?" "I can feel it." "You're not free. Tell me how to help." Rick smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Not everything broken needs fixing, Morty. Sometimes you just listen. Listen to what? To what's still alive inside you," Rick murmured. "Even in dreams." Morty blinked. The field flickered, turning translucent. The stars began to move faster, streaking across the sky like falling lanterns. Rick's outline grew fainter, his coat blending with the light. "Rick!" Morty reached out, grabbing at the air, but his hands passed right through him. "Don't be scared, Morty," Rick said, his voice now echoing like it came from both everywhere and nowhere. "Dreams aren't for rescue. They're for remembering what you still love." Morty's knees hit the ground. "But I can't just remember you. I need you to come back." Rick's voice softened. "I know. But remembering is the start of coming back." And then he was gone. The field dimmed. The stars folded into themselves until there was nothing left but quiet blackness. Morty's eyes opened slowly. The ceiling above him glowed faintly from the nightlight in his room. His blanket had slipped off his shoulder. He was sweating, his heart still pounding. The dream lingered like mist, The field, the voice, the stars that dripped like tears. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The clock read 3:42 a.m. He turned his head toward the window. The rain had stopped. The world was perfectly still. He thought about the words, "Dreams aren't for rescue. They're for remembering what you still love." He stood quietly, padding across the cold floor in his socks. The house was asleep. The air smelled faintly of dust and coffee, Rick's smell still clinging to the garage. He opened the door gently. The blue light of the portal gun recharger glowed like a heartbeat in the dark. Rick's tools lay scattered on the bench. His coat was still hanging from the same hook. Morty sat down on the cold floor beside the workbench. He stared at the coat for a long time, as if waiting for it to move. After a while, he pulled a blanket from the nearby chair, Summer's probably, and draped it over his shoulders. He whispered, "You're not gone, are you?" The silence didn't answer, but the faint hum of the machines felt different tonight, softer, almost responsive. Morty smiled faintly. "Yeah, I didn't think so." He lay down there on the garage floor, staring at the blinking lights. His eyelids grew heavy again. Before sleep took him, he thought he heard something, a quiet laugh, drifting through the air vents, and in that half-dream, half-memory space, he imagined Rick somewhere out there, maybe in another world, sitting under the same stars. The distance between them didn't feel so wide anymore. When Summer peeked into the garage just before dawn, she found Morty curled up under the blanket, the tools scattered around him. She sighed softly, shook her head, and covered him with another layer. Outside, the night was breaking into morning. The sky glowed faint blue, the color of promise. Somewhere, maybe in dream, maybe in memory. Rick's voice echoed faintly, warm and low. "Good job, kid." And Morty, still asleep, smiled. The cell had no corners. That's what Rick noticed first when he woke up. The walls curved upward and disappeared into a dim haze, the kind of geometry that played tricks on tired eyes. The air was dry, metallic. Somewhere above, a slow drip echoed. Not water this time, but plasma, condensed from recycled light. Each drop fell with perfect rhythm, hitting the floor like the tick of an invisible clock. He sat up slowly. The dream he'd been having, Morty's voice, the sound of wind through grass, slipped through his fingers before he could catch it. For a moment, he just listened to the drip. 1, 2, 3, his mind, restless as always, began to build equations out of the timing, searching for pattern where there was none. He laughed under his breath. "Still a genius in a box," he muttered. His boots scuffed against the floor as he stood. He hadn't seen a guard in days. Maybe there were no guards at all. Maybe this place wasn't built to contain him. Maybe it was built to let him think about why he was here. He began walking the perimeter again, dragging his fingers along the smooth wall. Cold, seamless, not even molecular gaps for him to exploit. Whoever designed this cage knew him too well. All right, he said to the empty air. "You win, round whatever this is." He stopped near the far corner, though again there weren't really corners, just a faint curve where wall met floor. Something caught his eye there, a shift in color so small it could have been a hallucination. He knelt down. There, etched faintly into the pale surface, was a rectangle, no bigger than a sheet of paper. Not carved, not burned, drawn. He squinted. It was chalk. For a long time he didn't move. He just stared at it, feeling the edges of his sanity tilt. "Okay," he whispered. "Either someone smuggled art supplies into the galaxy's highest security metaphysical prison, or I'm finally losing it." He reached out and ran a finger over the lines. The chalk smudged, real, not a projection. He laughed once, sharp, disbelieving, and then caught himself. He pressed his palm flat against the little drawing. The chalk felt warm, and then he felt it. A breeze. It was faint, impossibly faint, but it was there, air moving against his skin. The kind that doesn't belong in sealed environments. He froze. Rick Sanchez, scientist of 1,000 worlds, conqueror of time and matter, suddenly felt very small. He pressed his ear closer. The sound came through softly, like wind over tall grass. He could have started tearing into it. Could have tried to replicate the molecular pattern, dig through the floor, rewrite matter with a thought, but something stopped him. This wasn't about escape. Not the physical kind, anyway. He knew that now. The vent voice, the whispers that sounded like Morty, like his own mind, had been hinting at it all along. This prison wasn't walls. It was him. He sat back, cross-legged, staring at the chalk door. "I get it," he murmured. "You want me to walk through something that isn't there." He chuckled dryly. "Real funny. You think I'm that poetic?" But still he kept staring. The air continued to drift through, carrying with it something else now, a faint hum, familiar, soft, like an old song played from a dying speaker. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. The melody wasn't exact, but it reminded him of a lullaby he once heard. Maybe something Beth had sung to Summer when she was little. Maybe something he'd made up one night, too drunk to remember. His eyes opened again. The chalk lines shimmered faintly, glowing at the edges. The breeze grew stronger. "All right," he said softly. "Fine. Let's see what's on the other side." He stood up and brushed the dust from his coat. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't calculate. He didn't theorize or overthink. He just reached out. His hand passed through the chalk, not like through smoke, not like through a portal. More like dipping fingers into memory, something solid but not real, warm but distant. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and felt the air shift around him. The cell dissolved into darkness. Then came the light. It wasn't harsh, not like lab fluorescence or portal glare. It was gentle, soft, hearts pulsing with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He blinked until his eyes adjusted. He was standing in an infinite corridor made of reflections, like being inside a shattered mirror that somehow held itself together. The floor shimmered with faint ripples as he walked. Each wall flickered with moments from his past, a laughing Beth as a child, a young Morty running through the garage, Unity's face lit by the glow of 1,000 synchronized suns. He stopped at one reflection, himself, sitting at a table, drunk and tired, staring at an unfinished invention. His reflection looked up, met his gaze, and smirked. "You think this is new, huh?" the reflection said. Rick didn't respond. The reflection laughed, the same hollow sound he'd heard 1,000 times from his own throat. "You've built prisons like this before, Rick. Every time you said you didn't care, every time you laughed it off. You've been in this cell for years." Rick turned away, muttering, "I didn't come here to talk philosophy with a mirror." But the reflection followed him, voice echoing down the corridor. "Then why did you come here? To escape. You've already done that. 1,000 times. You're here because you ran out of universes to run to." Rick stopped walking. The chalk door glowed faintly behind him, like a memory refusing to close. Ahead, the corridor bent into endless light. He didn't know what waited there. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He reached into his pocket, expecting his flask, but found nothing, just air. He smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Guess that's progress," he muttered. He turned toward the light and began walking. Each step echoed softly, fading slower than the last. The corridor responded. The mirrors shifted, showing flashes not of regret but of possibility. Morty's laughter. Beth's hands fixing something in the garage. Summer humming to herself. He realized then that this wasn't punishment. It was permission to look, to feel, to finally stop running. As he walked, the corridor began to hum again, the same tune that had slipped through the chalk door. He found himself humming along without meaning to, and somewhere, miles or memories away, maybe in a dream, maybe in reality, Morty stirred in his sleep and whispered. He found it. Rick didn't hear him, but maybe he didn't need to. The chalk door faded behind him, leaving only the light ahead. He kept walking until everything went quiet again, and for the first time in a long while, Rick Sanchez smiled. Beth sat in the garage, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines that hadn't been touched in weeks. The air smelled faintly of oil, solder, and dust, her father's scent. It was strange how even after everything, the disappearances, the silence, the rumors of what happened in the Federation, this place still felt like him. A small cube rested on the workbench in front of her. Smooth, metallic, almost breathing. It had been there for as long as she could remember, tucked beneath a pile of abandoned gadgets and interdimensional junk. She'd seen it dozens of times as a kid, but Rick had always brushed her off when she asked about it. "Don't touch that. Beth, it's not finished." She used to think it was another one of his dangerous toys. Now as she stared at it under the dim yellow light, she realized it wasn't dangerous. It was deliberate. Everything her father made carried a purpose, even when it looked like chaos. She picked it up. The surface was cold, smooth as glass. A faint shimmer pulsed beneath her fingertips. and the cube emitted a soft hum as though recognizing her. "Mom?" a voice said from behind her. Beth flinched. Morty stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, hair messy, eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion only nightmares could make. "You're up early," she said, forcing a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," Morty mumbled, stepping closer. His eyes flicked to the cube. "What's that?" Beth turned it over in her hand. "I'm not sure, but I think your grandpa wanted me to find it." Morty frowned. "You think it's like a trap or something?" "A memory bomb? He used to make those." She laughed quietly, a sound that was equal parts fondness and ache. "So with your grandpa everything was both a trap and a memory." Morty sat on the stool beside her, watching as she placed the cube on the table. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The hum filled the silence like a heartbeat. Finally Beth pressed her thumb against the top. The cube pulsed once, then opened, not mechanically, but organically, like a blooming flower made of light. Thin ribbons of holographic script spiraled upward, coalescing into an image. Rick's face. But this wasn't the Rick they knew, not the swaggering, cynical one who mocked everything sacred. His expression was still, calm, almost gentle. "Hey, kiddo," the recording said softly. Beth froze. Morty leaned closer, eyes wide. "If you're seeing this, then either I'm dead or I'm doing something I can't come back from," Rick continued, his tone even. "Either way, it means I trust you to handle what comes next." Beth swallowed hard. "Dad," the hologram flickered slightly. Rick looked off-screen, muttered something to himself, then returned to focus. "You always thought I didn't care. About you, about family, about anything. Truth is, caring's the only thing that ever scared me. I ran because it hurt too much to stay." Morty's jaw tightened. Beth reached out instinctively, touching his hand. Rick's image shifted, leaning forward. "This isn't some emotional manipulation trick, Beth. I didn't build this message to apologize. I built it because there's something coming, something I can't stop alone. Maybe I never could." The hologram dimmed slightly, then projected an image of swirling energy, a rift stretching across space, flickering with impossible colors. Morty blinked. "What is that?" Rick's voice answered as if he'd heard him. "That's the continuum vein, the multiverse's spinal cord. I touched it once. Thought I could rewrite the laws of existence. Turns out it rewrote me." Beth felt her pulse quicken. "He's talking about—" When he disappeared, Rick's voice softened. "Beth, if you want to find me, the real me, don't follow coordinates. Follow intent. The vein connects every possible version of us. Somewhere in there I left a piece of myself. But only you can open it." He looked straight at her then. The hologram's eyes, though artificial, felt almost alive. "You used to fix your toys instead of crying when they broke. You built things. That's what you got from me. But what you didn't get, what I hope you never do, is the belief that everything's replaceable. Don't make my mistake." Beth's vision blurred. She blinked back tears, clenching her fists. The hologram paused. Then softer. "Tell Morty. Tell him I'm proud of him. Even if I never said it, he's better than I ever was." The light dimmed completely, leaving the garage in silence again. Morty's voice cracked first. He said my name." Beth nodded slowly, staring at the now dormant cube. "Yeah, he did." They sat there for a long time, neither sure what to say next. The cube was still glowing faintly, pulsing like a heart. Morty finally broke the silence. "So what now?" Beth exhaled, steadying herself. "Now we find out where he went." She turned back to the workbench, pulling out the old journal Rick had left behind. Most of it was indecipherable, equations folded into metaphors, pages that restructured themselves when read. But one line at the bottom of the last page stood out now more than ever. "The only way out is through what you refuse to remember." Beth traced the words with her finger. "He left a trail," she said. "And we're going to follow it." Morty hesitated. "You sure that's a good idea, Mom? Every time someone goes looking for him, things—" "Frick!" Beth smiled faintly, the kind that didn't reach her eyes but hid the fear underneath. "Things already broke, Morty. I'm just trying to see if they can still fit together." She packed the cube carefully into her bag. It pulsed once in response, like it knew it was being taken home. Outside, the night was quiet, stars scattered across a black sky that somehow felt closer than ever. The garage lights flickered as they stepped out. For the first time in months, Beth felt purpose. Somewhere out there in the endless web of realities, her father was alive, or at least the part of him that still wanted to be found. She glanced at Morty, who was staring up at the stars, his blanket trailing behind him. "Get some rest," she said softly. "We leave tomorrow." Morty nodded, though his eyes didn't move from the sky. "Do you think he's looking back?" Beth hesitated. "I think he's waiting for us to." And with that, the two of them disappeared into the quiet glow of the house, leaving the garage lights to hum softly behind them. And the cube for a moment shimmered once more, as though Rick himself had heard them. The cell had no sound now. No footsteps, no guards, no hum of machinery. Only the dripping, slow, patient, eternal, falling from the ceiling into a puddle that shimmered faintly like liquid glass. Rick sat in that silence for so long that time began to feel circular. Drops echoed like heartbeats, each one stitching the seconds back into themselves. He wasn't sure if he was still awake, or if he ever truly had been. His hands rested in his lap, trembling, stained with the faint residue of plasma chalk he'd found near the corner of the floor. He didn't remember picking it up, didn't remember drawing with it, but when he looked down, there it was, a tiny chalk door neatly outlined on the stone beneath his knees. It was small, childlike. He almost laughed. "Very funny subconscious," he muttered. Then he felt it, a breath. A soft, unmistakable wind passing through the lines. Impossible. There was no airflow in this cell. No vents down here. No reason for the faint warmth that brushed his fingertips, like a whisper from a different place. Rick froze. He leaned closer. The drawn door shimmered faintly. Not glowing, not quite. More like the light you see behind closed eyelids when someone walks past a lamp. He should have dismissed it. He should have reasoned his way out of it. But instead, for the first time in a long time, he simply listened. A drop fell. Another. Then a pause. And in that pause, something changed. The chalk began to fade. Not erased. Absorbed. The lines melted into the floor, leaving behind a faint indentation, and then, with a quiet sigh, a soft golden light began to leak through the crack. Rick rubbed his eyes. "Okay, yeah, definitely dreaming now." But even as he said it, his body moved. Slowly, as though pulled by the memory of motion rather than choice. He reached out, pressed his palm to the light and felt warmth bloom against his skin, gentle like the heat of a morning sun he hadn't seen in years, and then the world fell away. Not violently, not like an explosion or a warp jump. It dissolved. The walls rippled, soft as silk, and the cell unfolded into an endless corridor of mirrors stretching in both directions. Rick staggered back, squinting. The air smelled like ozone and lilac. Each mirror reflected not just his face, but a version of it. Younger, older, bearded, laughing, broken. Every Rick that ever was staring back. "Great," he muttered. "Just what I needed." A cosmic therapy session. But there was no voice answering him. Only silence, and the slow hum of the mirrors breathing. He stepped closer to the nearest reflection. The Rick was smiling faintly. Not the usual sarcastic grin, but something softer. The kind of smile that comes when you finally understand something you'd been running from. Rick stared at it, frowning. "What are you so smug about?" The reflection didn't speak. It just reached up, and on the other side of the glass placed its hand against his. The glass felt cool. Then the mirror whispered. Not in words, but in vibration. A soft resonance that traveled from his fingertips into his chest, into his bones, and there, deep in the marrow of himself, something shifted, a memory, unbidden. Beth, small, maybe 5 years old, holding up a toy she'd broken. "Can you fix it, Daddy?" He remembered saying, "Oh, of course I can." He remembered her smile, the one that believed him completely, and he remembered breaking the toy again. Weeks later, just to see if he could make it better, he had forgotten that part. The memory dissolved. The mirror rippled. He walked further down the corridor, passing reflection after reflection, each one showing a life he might have lived. One Rick was a simple scientist with a family who loved him. Another had never left Earth at all. One wore a wedding ring. Another had no arms. Some were kind. Some were monsters. Every few steps, a fragment of his heart felt heavier. He stopped before one final mirror, taller than the rest, its surface not clear but fogged. Inside he could just barely make out the outline of a figure. Himself, yes, but not entirely. Something about it was peaceful, like looking at a version of himself who had finally stopped running. He reached forward again. "Who are you?" he whispered, and for the first time the reflection answered. "I'm who you were before you decided to be clever." The voice wasn't external. It was his own, older maybe or younger. It didn't matter. It came from inside and outside at once. Rick let out a shaky breath. "You mean before I ruined everything?" The reflection didn't respond. It only tilted its head, almost kindly, as though forgiving him for saying it. Rick stood there for a long time. Then finally he said quietly, "All right." "What now?" The reflection lifted its hand again and pointed toward the ceiling. Rick looked up. Above him the corridor wasn't a roof, it was sky. A vast dark ocean of stars, not distant but dripping. Each one fell like a bead of light, melting into the air before touching the ground. The sound was faint and rhythmic, like rain in slow motion. One drop landed on his cheek, warm, soft. He laughed once, quietly. "Guess the stars are leaking now, huh?" The laughter caught in his throat. He looked back at the floor, at where the chalk door had been, and saw that the light beneath his feet had become something else. A pathway. A trail of soft luminescence leading forward, deeper into the mirrored corridor. And somewhere ahead, faintly, he could hear music. Not mechanical, but human. A lullaby. The same tune Beth used to hum when she was little, when she thought he wasn't listening. He took a step. Then another. Each mirror he passed dimmed slightly as though acknowledging his choice. The corridor around him began to fold again, not closing but transforming. The reflections blurred, becoming walls of soft gold, light bending around him like fabric. The air was warm now, comforting. He felt the weight of his flask in his pocket. He pulled it out, stared at it for a moment. Then, with a small smile, poured the last drop onto the glowing path. The liquid spread like ink, and where it touched, the light grew brighter, he whispered. Half to himself, half to the unseen sky. "All right, you beautiful metaphorical nightmare. Show me the way out." And so he walked, not breaking free, but becoming free, through a world of melting mirrors and falling stars, leaving behind the cold logic of escape for something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more real. Because maybe, he thought, freedom wasn't about running at all. Maybe it was about finally slowing down enough to listen to the sound of your own heart, even when it echoed through a prison that looked exactly like you. And far above, in a universe that was finally beginning to forgive him, a single drop of starlight drifted downward, landing in his open palm. Warm as home, the corridor had grown quieter, softer, as if sound itself had started to tire. Rick's footsteps no longer echoed. They simply dissolved into the golden light beneath him. The mirrors that once lined the hall were fading into mist, one by one, until only a few stood upright. Faintly pulsing with their own fragile glow, Rick slowed down, chest rising and falling with a rare kind of calm. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he wasn't thinking of equations or escapes or endings. He was simply moving. Then he saw it. One last mirror stood ahead, taller than the others, its frame cracked but glowing faintly, humming with a sound like a low heartbeat. Rick approached it, squinting through the dim haze. At first he thought he saw himself again, but the figure inside the glass wasn't quite right. The hair was messier, the eyes softer, the posture uncertain. Morty. Rick's voice was barely a whisper. The reflection blinked. And for a moment Rick swore it was alive. He stepped closer, pressing his palm against the cold surface. "Morty?" The boy in the mirror, or whatever he was, didn't answer with words. Instead he tilted his head and smiled, that small nervous smile Rick knew better than anything. His hand rose, mirroring Rick's, until their palms met through the thin veil of glass. Rick's throat tightened. "You're not real, huh?" "Just another projection. Great, my subconscious has commitment issues." But the boy's expression didn't change. His lips moved slightly, not forming words but shapes that Rick somehow understood. "I'm here." The whisper didn't come from the air. It came from somewhere inside Rick's chest, that same place where he used to store regret and whiskey and equations that never solved anything real. He took a shaky breath. "You're just a mirror. You're not him," the reflection frowned. Its voice, that voiceless pulse, came again, soft but steady. "I am the part of him that believes you still care." Rick froze. The light around the mirror shifted, deepening into a twilight hue. For the first time since the cell, he didn't have an answer. Morty, or the image of him, took a small step back inside the reflection. Behind him, shadows of other moments began to appear. Rick handing Morty a portal gun, Morty laughing with Summer, Morty crying after another adventure gone wrong. Each image moved like the flicker of old film reels. Scenes of connection, fear and forgiveness, projected in silence. Rick felt something ache behind his ribs. "You shouldn't still look at me like that," he muttered. "You don't know the things I've done." The reflection didn't flinch. Instead, it reached into its pocket, a gesture so familiar that Rick almost laughed. When the reflection's hand came out, it was holding a small glowing orb. It pulsed softly, casting golden ripples across the surface of the mirror. Rick leaned in. "What's that?" Morty's image tilted his head again. "It's what you left behind." The orb pulsed once more, and Rick's vision filled with light. Suddenly the corridor fell away, and he was standing inside the garage back home. But everything was quieter, slower, like time was holding its breath. Tools hung mid-air. The portal gun shimmered, half-built. Dust motes drifted lazily like suspended stars. Morty stood beside him now, not the reflection, but a dream of him. The same size, the same voice. "Rick," he said softly, "why do you keep trying to fix everything that isn't broken?" Rick didn't look at him. "Because everything is broken, Morty. You just haven't noticed the cracks yet." Morty shook his head. "Maybe you're the one who broke them just to make sure you had something to fix." Rick turned sharply, ready to snap back, but when he looked at Morty's face, the anger melted. There was no fear there, no resentment, just quiet, unshakable love, the kind that didn't need proof or apology. He sighed. "You're not really him, are you?" The boy smiled faintly. "I'm the part of him that still believes you'll come home." Rick swallowed hard. He could feel something in his chest loosen, like a knot untying after years of being pulled too tight. The dream around them began to fade. The tools vanished first. Then the shelves, then the walls. Soon only the two of them remained, surrounded by the same soft golden light from before. Morty's form flickered slightly. He stepped closer, placing a hand over Rick's heart. It didn't feel like touch, but warmth, like sunlight remembered from another lifetime. Rick whispered, "I've done a lot of things I can't undo, kid." "I know," the reflection murmured. "But you can stop trying to undo them." "That's enough." Rick looked down, blinking through the shimmer in his eyes. The boy was fading now, slowly, peacefully. His voice lingered one last time. "Go find the next door, Rick, it's waiting." The mirror world began to reform around him. The corridor returned, and quieter than before. The last mirror stood open now, its frame glowing with a soft silver light. Through it, Rick could see an expanse of deep blue, a horizon made not of sky but of water. He exhaled. "Figures. The next stop's a damn metaphor, too." But still, he smiled. It wasn't wide or showy, just enough to crack through the weight of silence. He took one last look at the mirror behind him. The reflection of Morty lingered faintly, waving once before dissolving completely. Rick adjusted his coat, straightened his back and whispered, "See you soon, kid." Then he stepped through the glass. The sensation wasn't falling, it was floating, like being caught between two breaths. The light faded, replaced by the sound of distant waves and the slow rhythm of a heartbeat that might have been the ocean's or his own. Rick opened his eyes. All around him, time itself shimmered like liquid sapphire. He was standing in or drifting what above a vast, endless sea where moments floated like bottles, and just before the last glimmer of the mirror vanished behind him, he heard Morty's voice again, soft as a memory. "You were never really trapped. Rick, you were just waiting to forgive yourself." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, guess I'm working on it." And with that, he began to drift forward, toward the ocean that separated every memory he'd ever tried to forget. The stars above him pulsed, breathing slowly, as if the universe itself was whispering lullabies. And for the first time in years, Rick didn't fight it. He just listened. The air didn't feel like air anymore. It was softer, dense and slow, like the world had traded sound for stillness. Rick hovered above an ocean so blue it seemed alive, every wave shimmering with faint golden veins that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The surface wasn't water exactly. It rippled like liquid glass, reflecting flashes of his past, A lab bench, Morty's nervous grin, Beth's silhouette framed in kitchen light. He floated for a while, or maybe for hours. Time had no edges here. It stretched and folded like silk. Somewhere far off, a low hum vibrated through the sea, the same frequency that used to live inside the hum of his machines. Only this time it wasn't mechanical. It was gentle, like a lullaby hummed by the universe itself. Rick's boots brushed the surface and the ripples expanded, sending light in circles around him. He knelt down, touched the ocean, and watched it respond. The touch didn't feel cold. It felt aware. The ripples shifted, forming faint shapes, like faces made of memory. Morty's voice, faint but distinct, drifted through the air. "You're not supposed to be here alone, Rick." Rick's eyes narrowed. "You again. What, this is my brain now? Some fancy guilt aquarium?" No answer, just the sound of the ocean breathing. Then, from a few feet away, a bottle floated into view. A small glass cylinder sealed with silver wax, glowing softly from within. Rick picked it up. The glow flickered, then steadied. He hesitated. "I swear, if this explodes in my hand, I'm suing my subconscious." The moment he uncorked it, light poured out. Not harsh, not blinding. It unfolded like a film reel projected into the misty sky above. And there it was. A memory. Rick stood in his own garage again, years younger, laughing with Morty over some dumb experiment that had gone wrong. The two of them were covered in green goo, Morty panicking, Rick cackling uncontrollably. The image played soundlessly, but Rick remembered every word. Every tone. "Okay," Rick muttered, "so, bottles of memory, cute." He tossed the empty glass aside, but before it hit the surface, the ocean absorbed it, turning the shards into small sparks of light that drifted upward into the sky. Then another bottle floated by. And another. Soon there were dozens, drifting lazily across the sea like messages from forgotten timelines. Rick picked one at random. Inside, he saw himself building the portal gun for the very first time. Beth was younger then, standing at the door, asking him what he was doing. He remembered what he didn't say that day, the sentence he swallowed instead of speaking. A sigh escaped him. "You never stop showing me the hits, huh?" He sat down on the liquid surface, legs crossed, staring at the horizon. It looked endless, the way infinity sometimes feels too quiet to be impressive. In the distance, faint islands of light floated, each one pulsing like a heartbeat, each one shaped differently. Some were tall spires, some small flickers, memories, regrets, entire lifetimes. He didn't know. Rick rubbed his eyes. "I get it. Emotional purgatory, symbolic redemption arc. Real cute, but the ocean didn't argue. Purr just kept breathing. Another bottle touched his foot. He almost ignored it, but this one was different. Its light wasn't gold or silver. It was faintly green, soft like an old CRT glow. He picked it up, twisted the seal, and opened it. The voice that came out wasn't Morty's, it was Beth's. Younger, uncertain, but warm. "Dad, I know you don't really like birthdays, but I made you something anyway." The light swirled, forming a hologram of a small handmade object. A simple clay figure of Rick, rough-edged and lopsided, holding a tiny flask. He had forgotten that. He had forgotten how she'd looked up at him, proud and expectant, how he'd laughed it off and pretended it didn't matter, how her smile had faltered just a little. Now the sound of that moment echoed over the sea, soft and forgiving. Rick looked away. His reflection shimmered on the surface beside the memory. Older now, worn, quieter. "Love is the only constant," he whispered, repeating a line he once wrote, but never believed. And I spent half my life dividing by it. For a long while he said nothing. The bottles drifted in silence around him, their faint light filling the horizon like fireflies trapped in slow motion. Then, somewhere deep below, a sound stirred. A deeper hum. The ocean began to move gently at first, then with rhythm. The waves started forming spirals, converging toward a single point in the distance. Rick stood scanning the horizon. A whirlpool was forming, but it wasn't chaotic. It looked calm, almost welcoming. Well, that's either my subconscious telling me to move forward. He took a sip from his flask. Or I'm about to drown in symbolism. Again. He walked toward it. The surface of the water rose slightly under his boots, carrying him like an elevator of liquid memory. The closer he got, the more the whirlpool glowed, not white but soft violet. the color of twilight between sleep and waking. When he reached the center, he could see something glowing deep below, not a portal, but a sphere of light pulsing like a heart. Rick leaned over the edge. His reflection rippled again, and this time he saw Morty beside him, not a memory but a projection of him, standing calm, hands in his pockets. "Guess this is it, huh?" Morty said quietly. "The part where you stop running." Rick smirked faintly. "Kid, I've been running since before you were a thought in your dad's high school nightmares." "Yeah," Morty replied. "And look where it got you," Rick chuckled. The sound came out softer than expected. "You're getting better at my lines." The boy's reflection smiled, then pointed toward the light beneath the water. "It's not an escape, Rick. It's a memory you haven't made yet." Rick frowned. "That's not how memories work." Morty tilted his head. "You sure?" Before Rick could answer, the reflection vanished, replaced by rippling violet light. The ocean beneath him began to glow brighter, and the hum grew deeper, almost like a song now. A lullaby. He closed his eyes. For once, he didn't think about where it led. He didn't plan. He didn't calculate. He just stepped forward, letting gravity or forgiveness or whatever this was take him. The world tilted. The sound of the ocean faded into heartbeat-like thumps. And for a brief, suspended moment, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in ages, weightlessness without fear. Then, everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing on the shore of that same ocean, but the bottles were gone. The sea was calm now, perfectly still, glowing faintly under a purple sky. He looked down. In his hand was a single bottle, not glowing, not labeled, completely empty. He turned it in his fingers and smiled weakly. "Guess this one's for later." He tucked it into his coat, turned toward the horizon, and began walking, following the faint line of light that shimmered where sky met water. Behind him, the ocean whispered softly, as though it had finished telling its story. And somewhere far away, a single bottle drifted onto the surface again, uncorked, singing faintly with the echo of Morty's laughter. Rick didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He already remembered. When Rick opened his eyes, the ocean was gone. The air was dry and humming, familiar, mechanical. He stood in a corridor of glass and metal, each wall glowing faintly with soft, rhythmic light. The sound reminded him of a heartbeat filtered through a synthesizer. Thump, thump, thump. The corridor stretched infinitely in both directions. Behind him, the sea of memory had vanished, leaving only the faint scent of ozone and salt. Ahead of him, a faint golden glow pulsed from beyond a bend. Steady, patient waiting. Rick exhaled. "All right, subconscious. What's next?" Another therapy session disguised as quantum architecture. He started walking. His boots echoed softly on the metallic floor, though the sound didn't behave normally. It seemed to fold inward, looping back to him a half-second later. He noticed small panels along the walls flickering with images, flashes of his inventions, fragments of his laughter, moments of failure, everyone looping silently like a broken reel. As he moved, the hum grew louder, deeper, not menacing but intimate, like a pulse that belonged both to the place and to him. He followed it until he turned a final corner and saw it, a machine. It wasn't like any he had ever built. It wasn't cold or angular. It was soft, almost organic. Its surface shimmered with faint pastel light, as if it were breathing. Translucent tubes ran across it like veins, carrying warm, glowing energy that pulsed in rhythm with the sound. It stood in the center of a large circular chamber, suspended by nothing, floating above a small dais. Rick stepped closer, eyes narrowing. What in the name of emotional symbolism is this? He reached out. The moment his hand brushed the machine, it responded. The hum shifted, matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. The light softened. The tubes began glowing a deeper gold, and then it spoke, not in words, but in memories. The air around him shimmered, and suddenly the room was filled with images. Beth as a child, Morty as a toddler sitting on Rick's shoulders, Summer waving from a school bus. They flickered in and out like projections made of mist, overlapping and fading in rhythm with the machine's breathing light. Rick froze. His throat tightened. Each image was drawn from a place in his mind he'd buried under formulas and flask fumes. 1,000 tiny fragments, smiles, sounds, hugs he hadn't returned. all the things he'd ignored while chasing something bigger. He tried to back away, but the machine pulsed gently, as though asking him to stay. Its voice, or maybe his own inner one, echoed softly inside his head. "This is what you built me for." Rick blinked. "I didn't build you. I don't build soft things." "You did," the voice said, calm and quiet. "You just never knew it." He frowned, circling the machine. Its glow pulsed in sync with his steps, mirroring his pace, his rhythm. It was like watching his own soul breathing outside his body. He crouched, studying the surface. Its texture rippled gently, like the skin of a bubble holding light. Beneath it, faint images moved, neurons firing, laughter echoing, stars collapsing into tiny points of light. It wasn't circuitry. It was memory. Living memory interwoven with emotion. A wave of recognition washed over him. He had built this, or something like it, years ago. He remembered sketching its design one sleepless night, trying to invent a device that could transmute emotional pain into physical energy. He'd called it Project Empathium. But he abandoned it after a single prototype failed. Now it was here, completed, breathing, waiting. Rick rubbed his face with both hands. "So this is it, huh? My big symbolic payoff? The heart machine. The metaphor that'll tie the season together." The voice in his mind didn't laugh. "You built machines to understand the universe," it said. "But every time you were trying to understand yourself." Rick swallowed. "So you sound like a therapist I'd vaporize." "Maybe," the voice replied gently, "but you keep listening." He didn't have a response for that. The machine pulsed again, brighter now. The air grew warmer. Rick felt it, not heat, but something deeper, a vibration inside his ribs. He realized the hum wasn't external anymore. It was syncing with him, the entire chamber filled with soft golden light, and suddenly more memories unfolded, not as images, but sensations. The warmth of Morty's hug after their first successful adventure, the weight of Beth's small hand clutching his finger. The sound of Summer laughing while fixing one of his old drones. Rick clenched his jaw. His hands trembled. He whispered, "You're showing me everything I've wasted." "No," said the voice. "Everything you still have." The light flickered, not out of malfunction, but emotion. He could feel it. The machine wasn't powered by energy. It was powered by empathy. His empathy. The part of him he'd suppressed for decades under arrogance, fear, and self-loathing. He laughed bitterly. "So what? This thing runs on feelings now." "Great. The least efficient energy source in the multiverse." The machine pulsed softly, like it was smiling. Rick's laughter broke. He sat down on the floor, back against the cold wall, staring at the glowing structure before him. "You know," he muttered, "I used to think I built machines to control chaos, to make sense of things, but I think I was just scared. Scared of how messy people are." The machine glowed brighter. Its hum deepened, harmonizing with his words. "Morty once asked me," Rick continued, voice low, "if I ever built anything that didn't explode or kill or fix something that wasn't broken. I told him no. But maybe—" He exhaled, long and shaky. "Maybe this one's different." He stood, placing a hand gently on the soft, glowing surface. The warmth soaked into his palm. "All right," he said quietly, "show me what you've got left." The machine reacted instantly. A pulse of pure light radiated outward, filling the room. For a heartbeat, the entire chamber became transparent. Rick could see through the walls into infinite versions of himself. Some were older, some younger, some alone, some surrounded by family. All of them staring back at him. In that instant, the hum reached its peak, and Rick understood. The soft machine wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even a tool. It was him. The emotional core he'd forgotten existed. Every decision, every regret, every flicker of love he'd tried to suppress had built this. When the light faded, the room returned to silence. The machine still pulsed softly, but slower now, calmer, like it was resting. Rick stood there for a long moment, his reflection faintly visible on the glowing surface. He finally spoke, voice almost a whisper. "Guess you don't need fixing, huh?" The hum replied with a faint echo, almost like laughter. He smiled weakly, turned away, and started walking toward the far end of the chamber. The door slid open without a sound, revealing a quiet pathway bathed in pale blue light. Before stepping through, he glanced back one last time. The machine's glow dimmed slightly. Not dying, just waiting. Keep breathing, he murmured. Someone's got to remember. Then he stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the hum, the warmth, and the faint shimmer of a machine that was never meant to be perfect, just soft. And for the first time in his long, infinite life, Rick didn't feel like running from it. The sound of the machine faded behind him like a lullaby fading in a dream. Rick walked through the long corridor that seemed to pulse with its own soft awareness, the walls breathing in slow rhythm as if the place itself were alive. There were no alarms, no guards, no warnings, only a sense of release, like the universe had stopped holding its breath. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, but not from fear, from stillness. For once there was nothing to calculate. No escape route, no variable to solve. The air ahead shimmered faintly, and with each step he took, the corridor began to dissolve into light, until he found himself standing beneath a sky that wasn't really a sky at all. Until he found himself standing beneath a sky that wasn't really a sky at all. It was a ceiling of stars, not the kind he traveled through, not distant suns with coordinates and physics attached, but quiet, painted stars that moved only when he blinked. They hung above him like gentle spectators, patient and endless. Rick stood there, blinking against the starlight. He was still in the same clothes, still carrying the faint smell of ozone from the soft machine's chamber. The ground beneath him was metallic, yet it felt soft under his boots, almost like the dream was cushioning his return to reality. He pulled out his flask, turned it in his fingers, and let out a dry chuckle. "Guess it's just you and me again, huh?" No voice answered. No machine hummed back. Just silence, the kind that wasn't empty but full of possibility. He tilted the flask, took a small sip, and winced. The burn reminded him that he was still real. Still here, still unfinished. The prison walls around him were gone. The door that had held him for so long stood open behind him, cracked slightly on its hinges. The air that came through it was neither cold nor warm, simply gentle. Rick looked back once. There was no motion inside. The door didn't close. It didn't vanish dramatically into light. It simply stayed open, as if to say, "You can leave now." "You always could." He walked forward. Each step felt lighter, though his heart carried more weight than it ever had. For so long he had escaped through brilliance, through invention, through destruction. But this escape was quiet, the kind that didn't need proof. The kind you could only make when you stopped trying to. The path stretched into the horizon, bathed in faint bluish glow. A small wind drifted by, gentle like the breath of something asleep. Rick glanced up again. The stars seemed to move in rhythm with his steps, as if following him out. After a long while, he spoke softly into the air. "You win, universe. You actually got me to walk home instead of portal there. Hope you're happy." The wind whispered in reply, brushing his hair back like a hand of light. He smirked faintly. As he walked, the path began to shift underfoot, metal giving way to stone, stone to grass, grass to nothing but cool air. The stars above blurred, melting into dawn. For a moment he thought he was still dreaming. But then he felt it. Gravity returning in its familiar weight, the ache in his knees, the faint chill of the morning. He blinked again, and the sky above was no longer the sterile glow of a prison or the hallucination of a dream. It was real. He stood beneath an early sunrise, faint pink and violet stretching across the sky. The air smelled like dew and smoke and the faint chemical tang of home. Home. That word struck him in the chest harder than any laser blast. He looked down at his flask again. His reflection shimmered in the metal, tired, wrinkled, unshaven. He laughed softly. "You look like hell, Sanchez," and yet there was a gentleness to his voice he hadn't heard in years. He walked for a while longer, until the horizon revealed itself fully, a faint, distant outline of the earth he'd left behind. He could almost see the small shape of his house, his garage, maybe even the flicker of the portal light waiting to guide him in. But he didn't rush. Not this time. He walked slowly, letting the world catch up to him. Every few steps he would pause, listening to the silence that hummed between things, listening to the heartbeat of the universe he had once tried to conquer. It wasn't a grand symphony. It was a whisper, steady and patient. "You're still here." For the first time in his life, Rick didn't want to outsmart it. When he finally reached the edge of the last field, The colors of the sunrise deepened, gold washing over blue, blue fading into lavender. He stopped there just before stepping back into the world he'd left. The silence behind him stretched like a memory. He turned once more, looking back toward the invisible path that had brought him here, the soft machine, the mirrors, the ocean of suspended time, the versions of himself he'd seen and silently forgiven. Thanks, he murmured to no one in particular, for, I don't know, not vaporizing me, I guess. A faint sound answered, like distant laughter carried on wind. Or maybe it was his own. He smiled faintly. You're welcome. Then, without ceremony or fanfare, he stepped forward. The world accepted him quietly. The light of the rising sun caught the metal of his flask, painting it gold for a second before fading. The road ahead was empty, but not lonely. Somewhere beyond it, in a small suburban home cluttered with gadgets and ghosts, a boy was sitting in a garage, waiting. Rick adjusted his coat, breathed in the morning air, and whispered, "Guess it's time to go home." He took a deep breath. The kind that fills not the lungs, but something deeper, something tired and yearning. Then he exhaled slowly, like he was releasing decades of noise from his chest. The wind caught his sigh and carried it upward. It disappeared into the pale, waking light. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Rick Sanchez didn't feel like running from it. He didn't feel like proving or escaping or fixing. He simply felt alive. He looked up at the thinning stars one last time, faint pinpricks fading against dawn, and whispered almost affectionately, "Keep counting, boys. I'll take it from here." Then he walked on, flask in hand, eyes calm, steps steady, into the quiet morning that waited to welcome him home. The night had stretched thin, like the last string of a song that refuses to end. In the quiet garage, Morty sat with his knees pulled up, watching the soft flicker of a green portal light pulse against the walls. It wasn't open, just humming, faintly alive, like a sleeping creature breathing in slow rhythm. The rest of the house was silent. He'd woken before dawn, though he wasn't sure he'd really slept. Dreams had blurred too easily into memories. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of Rick, floating somewhere beyond glass walls, staring at something no one else could see. The dream always ended the same way. Morty reaching for him, fingers just short of contact, as the old man faded into light. Morty rubbed his eyes. "It's been months, dude," he whispered to himself, voice low and soft so it wouldn't echo. "You're supposed to come back." The hum of the garage answered, constant and patient. He leaned back against the wall, the cold concrete grounding him. Above, through a small skylight smeared with dust, the first pale hints of morning began to stretch across the sky. Blue melting into soft rose, a mug of cold cocoa sat beside him. He hadn't made coffee like Rick used to. Cocoa felt safer, gentler, like something that didn't expect him to be clever. He looked at the empty workbench, cluttered with inventions Rick had left behind. Some broken, some half-built, some glowing faintly for reasons Morty didn't understand. There was one machine in the corner that occasionally buzzed by itself, like it was remembering something. Morty left it alone. Every morning since Rick's disappearance, he'd done the same thing. He'd sneak out of bed before the sun rose, creep into the garage and sit in silence, waiting. He didn't know what for. Not exactly a rescue, not even a miracle, just a sign. Something that meant Rick was still out there thinking about him. This morning, though, something felt different. The hum of the portal light was softer than usual, almost like it was sighing. The air felt heavier, like it was holding a secret. Morty stared at the flicker, watching it cast faint patterns on the wall. "You know," he said, his voice trembling with sleep and sadness, "I used to think he could fix anything. Like, literally anything. He'd just take out some weird metal stick, say a bunch of words I didn't get, and boom, the problem solved." But he trailed off, his eyes unfocused. He couldn't fix himself. The sentence fell into the room like a stone sinking through water. Morty looked down at his hands, small and still boyish despite everything they'd been through. "He tried, though," he whispered. "I know he did." For a long time, the only sound was the low hum of the portal stabilizer. A faint breeze slipped through the small crack under the garage door, carrying the smell of wet grass and early light. Summer had woken once, a few hours earlier, and found him still there. She didn't say anything, just placed a folded blanket on his shoulders and left without turning on the light. Morty hadn't even thanked her. He couldn't. Words felt too fragile, like they'd crumble if he touched them. He stared at the portal one more time and sighed. "If you can hear me, Rick, I hope you're not doing something stupid." He smiled faintly, though it hurt. "Actually, nah, you probably are. That's kinda your thing." The smile faded, replaced by something softer. Not sadness, but longing wrapped in quiet acceptance. "Just don't forget me, okay? I don't care if it takes you a year or 10 or 100. I'll wait. They'll keep the garage warm." His words weren't loud enough for anyone to hear, but the air around him seemed to shift. The hum of the portal glowed a little brighter, just for a second before dimming again. Morty froze. His heart jumped. "Rick, nothing. Only the faint pulse of light, softer than before." He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the machine was just flickering from power drift. But a small part of him, the quiet, stubborn part that still believed in impossible things, whispered that it wasn't. That maybe, somewhere in the folds of reality, Rick had heard him. He reached out and touched the side of the portal generator. The metal was cool under his fingertips. "If you can hear me," he said again, "come home soon." I made cocoa." His voice cracked slightly. He blinked back tears, embarrassed even though no one was watching. He pressed his forehead against the table and closed his eyes. He could still smell Rick's old cologne, faint, metallic, mixed with motor oil. It hadn't faded completely. Outside, the first real light of morning spilled through the garage window, painting everything in shades of gold and blue. Dust floated through the air like tiny planets, drifting slowly. Morty watched them, dazed. The sound of a bird outside startled him, just a normal chirp, but after so much silence, it felt like the world was finally speaking again. He turned back to the portal light. It pulsed once, then again, then stilled, and for the first time, instead of feeling empty, the garage felt calm. Morty smiled faintly and whispered, "Yeah, I get it. You're out there somewhere, doing your thing. I'll see you soon." He leaned back, the blanket still around his shoulders, and let his head rest against the cold wall. His eyes began to flutter closed, too tired to keep waiting, but too peaceful to fight it. As he drifted toward sleep, the hum of the portal softened even more, blending perfectly with the rhythm of his breathing. Outside, the world slowly turned gold, and somewhere beyond that sky, across galaxies and half-remembered dreams, an old man walked toward home, a flask in his hand, a faint smile on his face, and the echo of his grandson's voice carrying softly through the folds of space. Back in the garage, Morty murmured one last thing before sleep took him fully. "Come home soon." "Rick." The light flickered once, like a heartbeat answering him. Then it faded into steady, quiet glow, warm, patient, and alive. The day began. When Rick came home, it wasn't with thunder or portals or the sharp hiss of plasma opening through space. It was quieter than that, quieter than Morty ever imagined it would be. The morning light was already spilling through the kitchen blinds, slow and soft. Like the sky itself was waking up after a long night of holding its breath, the first thing Morty noticed was the smell. Faintly metallic, faintly familiar. A mixture of engine grease and burnt toast. He blinked, still half dreaming, the blanket summer had given him falling from his shoulders as he sat up in the garage chair. For a long moment, he didn't move. The silence between heartbeats felt like a question the universe was asking him. Then, from inside the house came a sound, not loud, not mechanical, just the quiet scrape of a chair and the low sigh of someone sitting down. Morty stood. The world felt fragile as glass around him. Every step to the kitchen felt like walking through a dream he was afraid to break. And then he saw him. Rick sat at the table, like nothing had happened. Hair wild, coat torn, flask at his side. The same scientist who'd left the universe trembling countless times. But something about him was different. His eyes looked rested, not happy, not sad, but softer, alive in a way Morty hadn't seen before. "Hey, Morty's voice caught thin and small in the warm kitchen air. "Well, you're back." Rick didn't look up right away. He just stirred something in a mug. Coffee, maybe. Or something pretending to be coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, still scratchy but steady. "Looks that way." Morty stood there, not sure what to say. For all the times he'd imagined this moment, He'd never actually pictured it like this, and so quiet, so normal. No music, no tears, no dramatic speeches. Just sunlight cutting through the blinds, dust floating like lazy galaxies between them. Want some eggs? Rick asked suddenly. Morty blinked. Yeah, sure. Rick gestured with his fork toward the stove. A pan sat there, still steaming, with scrambled eggs that looked uneven but edible. Morty grabbed a plate and sat down across from him. Neither spoke for a long while. The sound of cutlery scraping plates filled the room. It was small, almost musical. Ordinary. Then Morty noticed something on Rick's wrist, a faint red mark shaped like a ring of light. He wanted to ask, but didn't. Instead, he said softly, "You... Okay." Rick took a sip of his coffee. His eyes flicked up, then back to the mug. "Define okay." Morty smiled faintly. "Alive, I guess." That got a half smile from Rick, the kind that appeared for a second before he could stop it. "Barely," he muttered. Then, after a pause, "Good enough." Sunlight crept higher across the table, glinting off his flask. Morty leaned forward, resting his elbows on the wood. "Where were you, Rick? I mean, what happened?" Rick stared at his reflection in the coffee. "I don't really know," he said, voice soft. "Somewhere in between everything and nothing, I guess. I kept seeing things I built, machines, people, versions of me. They all kept asking what I was trying to fix. Took me a while to realize I wasn't fixing anything. I was just remembering." He looked up at Morty then, really looked. "You ever notice that memories don't wait for you to be ready? They just show up. Same smell, same sound, same..." He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen, breakfast table, "and suddenly you're right back there." Morty nodded. He didn't completely understand, but he felt like he did. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sometimes I think about the day you left. I didn't even say goodbye, right? I just kept waiting for a portal. Like you'd pop out and say, 'Morty, get your crap together.'" He smiled weakly. "Guess I didn't think about what I'd say if you actually came back." Rick set down his mug. The steam rose between them, slow and ghost-like. "Then don't say anything. Just eat your damn eggs." Morty laughed, but it came out shaky. He picked up his fork and did as told. The eggs were warm, a little too salty but still good. And for some reason, that made him want to cry. Rick leaned back in his chair, watching him. The lines around his eyes softened, the way they did when he was pretending not to care. "You been taking care of the garage?" he asked after a while. "Yeah," Morty said, mouth half full. "I didn't touch your tools or anything. I just sat there sometimes, kinda made sure the lights stayed on." Rick nodded once. "Good kid." Morty froze. Rick didn't say things like that. Not out loud. The words hung in the air like sunlight through smoke. Fragile, fleeting, real. Neither spoke again for a few minutes. Outside, a bird chirped. The refrigerator hummed. The world for once felt like it wasn't falling apart. When Morty finished eating, he looked up at Rick again. "So what now?" Rick shrugged. "Now we live. Maybe fix a toaster. Maybe ruin a universe." "Haven't decided," Morty smiled. "You always say that." "Yeah," Rick said, half grinning. "But maybe this time I'll actually mean it." The kitchen filled with silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It felt warm, familiar. Like the house had been waiting for this. The quiet sound of two people sharing breakfast, both too tired to run from the past anymore. Morty leaned back and looked toward the window. The light outside was gold now, almost blinding. "It's weird," he murmured. "Everything's the same, but it doesn't feel the same." Rick followed his gaze. "That's 'cause we ain't the same, Morty. We never are after the kind of places we've been." Morty nodded. He didn't fully get it, but maybe he didn't need to. Sometimes understanding wasn't part of love. Sometimes love was just sitting there, eating eggs in silence, watching morning spill across the floor. Rick reached for his flask but didn't drink from it. Instead, he set it aside and said quietly, "Don't tell Beth I'm back yet." Morty frowned. "Why?" "Just want to sit here a bit longer," Rick said, eyes distant. "Feels nice." The way he said it made Morty's chest ache. He didn't want to break the spell either. So he just nodded. "So okay." Rick closed his eyes for a second. Maybe he was listening to the hum of the fridge. Maybe to the universe breathing through the thin walls of the house. When he opened them again, he smiled faintly. "You made cocoa yesterday, didn't you?" Morty blinked. "Yeah, how'd you—" Rick tapped his temple. "Heard it," Morty grinned. "You heard me?" Rick didn't answer, just smiled, small and secret. "Eat your eggs, kid," Morty laughed quietly. The sound filled the kitchen like sunlight spilling across a floor, gentle, alive and real. And for the first time since Rick had vanished, breakfast didn't feel lonely. It felt like a beginning, small, fragile, but enough. The old man and the boy sat in the golden quiet, sharing food, not words. The portal gun lay untouched on the counter, gathering dust, as if even it knew this moment was too human to interrupt. Outside, the sun rose higher, and the world, for a little while, was still. The garage was quieter than it had ever been. The kind of quiet that made the walls hum, not with sound but with memory. The air still carried that familiar metallic scent, the one that meant Rick had been here recently. Tools were scattered in perfect chaos, as if they were waiting for his next moment of clarity. Morty stood by the workbench, his eyes tracing the outlines of old experiments. He'd spent so many nights in this place, watching Rick build and destroy things that no one else could understand. But tonight was different. Rick wasn't here, and yet somehow he was everywhere. A small object caught Morty's eye, half hidden beneath a folded towel and an empty flask. It was a glass bottle, thick and cold, with a strange shimmer beneath its surface. Across its middle, written in Rick's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words: "Do not open." Morty froze. Rick never labeled things like that unless he meant it. Usually danger followed those words: explosions, portals, radioactive foam. But this bottle felt still. It wasn't glowing, humming, or pulsing. It just sat there, silent and patient, like it had been waiting to be found. Morty reached out, his fingers hesitating an inch above the glass. He could almost hear Rick's voice in his head, the usual mix of sarcasm and warning. "Hey, genius, if I wrote 'do not open,' maybe there's a reason." But curiosity was a language Morty had learned from Rick himself. And tonight, that language spoke softly, almost tenderly. He touched the bottle. It was warm, not from heat, but from something living inside. He turned it slowly in his hands, and for a moment light flickered through it, revealing faint symbols etched within the glass. They looked like equations, overlapping and shifting, but too fluid to be static math. He placed it carefully on the bench, exhaled, and whispered, "Sorry, Rick." Then he pulled the cork. No explosion. No flash of light. Just a faint, almost human sigh that drifted through the air. A shimmer rose from the bottle, not smoke, not hologram, something gentler, like light caught in a breath. It hovered, twisted, and slowly formed into shapes. Rick's voice came first. Not loud. Not the usual slurred mutter of a man half lost in his own intellect. It was calm, clear, almost fragile. "If you're hearing this, well, I guess I didn't get around to saying things the right way." "Not that I ever do." Morty's breath caught. He stepped closer. The light above the workbench dimmed, as if the room itself was leaning in to listen. Rick's image flickered into form. Not fully solid, not fully ghost. Just a soft, shimmering version of him, sitting on the same stool he always used. His holographic hands rested on invisible knees. His eyes, even in this projected state, looked tired, but not defeated. "You know, Morty, I've built entire galaxies. I've rewritten the laws of physics because I got bored one afternoon. But none of it, ever made me feel like I wasn't just floating until you showed up." Morty's throat tightened. His hands trembled as he held the bottle close, afraid the sound might stop if he moved too much. "I don't say stuff like this because it makes everything complicated," Rick continued. "And I'm not big on complicated feelings. I like numbers. Numbers make sense. But you don't. You never did. You just stayed, even when I didn't deserve it." The holographic Rick looked around as if taking in the garage one last time. "I left this for you because I figured one day I'd forget how to say it out loud. Or maybe I'd run out of universes to run to. Either way, this bottle isn't a goodbye. It's just data. That's what I told myself when I made it. Emotional data." Morty let out a shaky laugh through his tears. "Of course you'd call it that," he whispered. Rick's faint image smiled. That same crooked, self-mocking grin Morty knew so well. "Yeah, I had to hide it in science so I could stand recording it." "But you'll know what it really is." The hologram paused. The silence between words was heavy yet warm, like a blanket that remembered the shape of someone who used to sleep under it. "Morty." Don't turn into me. Don't build things just to avoid feeling them. Don't turn the universe into a distraction. There's beauty in sitting still, kid. There's power in staying. The projection flickered, almost fading. Morty panicked, stepping forward. Wait, Rick, don't... But then, softly, Rick's final words came through. If you ever wonder why I kept fixing the portal gun instead of fixing myself, it's because I didn't know how. But I think you might. You always had a better map of the heart than I did. So keep it safe. And if you ever need me... The hologram looked up directly into Morty's eyes. You already know where I'll be. Then the light faded. The projection dissolved into tiny particles that drifted upward like dust in sunlight. For a moment, Morty thought he could still see Rick's outline, faint, smiling, watching. The bottle was empty now, but in its hollow shape, there lingered a warmth, a pulse that matched the beating of Morty's own heart. He didn't put the cork back. Instead, he placed the bottle on a small shelf beside the portal gun, next to an old photo of him and Rick at blips and chits, laughing mid-argument. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees. The stars above seemed unusually close, like they were leaning down to listen too. Morty sat on the workbench stool and stayed there for a long time. No words, no plans, just breathing in the silence his grandfather had left behind. When Beth came to check on him hours later, she saw the faint light still glowing from the bottle. She didn't ask what it was. She just smiled sadly and whispered, "He finally said something, didn't he?" Morty nodded, his voice soft and steady. "Yeah, Mom, he did." Beth touched the glass, then turned to leave. As the door closed, Morty looked once more at the bottle, not as a relic, but as a promise. And somewhere, maybe in another timeline, Rick was sitting on a similar workbench, smirking at the irony of it all. In that version, maybe he wasn't alone. The night was long and gentle, the kind that lingered between silence and breath. Outside, the wind had gone quiet. Inside, the house hummed with the small sounds of sleeping people. A refrigerator clicking, her dog sighing in its dream, the low hum of the universe slipping softly past the window. Beth sat in the kitchen with a half-empty cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward and vanish. She wasn't really drinking it. It was something to hold, something warm in her hands. Across from her, Rick sat in the same chair he'd always claimed as his own. Slouched but awake, a shadow of light from the window tracing the curve of his face. For once, there were no tools, no blueprints, no gadgets humming on the table between them, just two mugs and the quiet. Beth didn't know how long they had been sitting like that, 5 minutes or an hour. Time around Rick always felt loose, like it could snap at any moment and rearrange itself. He finally spoke first, voice low and almost uncertain. "Didn't think you'd stay up?" Beth smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd come home." Rick looked down at his flask, though it stayed unopened beside his hand. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess we both surprise ourselves sometimes." They both chuckled, softly, awkwardly, and then silence filled the space again, comfortable in its own uneasy way. Beth studied him under the dim light. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, not just from age, but from weight, emotional gravity that even Rick Sanchez couldn't outwit. His eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, carried something she'd never seen there before, a kind of surrender. "Not defeat, but quiet honesty. Morty told me about the bottle," she said finally. Rick didn't flinch. He just nodded. "Yeah, guess it was time." Beth looked down, tracing her finger along the rim of her mug. "You always used to leave notes like that, half equations, half riddles. When I was a kid, I thought they were secret codes for me to solve. But now," she looked up. "Now I think they were the only way you knew how to say what you couldn't." Rick leaned back, exhaling. The faint sound of his breath mingled with the hum of the refrigerator. "You're not wrong." Beth let the words linger soft and fragile before she continued. "You know what I remember most about you leaving? It wasn't the fights. It wasn't Mom crying. It was that no one ever explained why. You just disappeared. And the worst part was, I still defended you." Rick's hand twitched slightly as if he'd been hit. "Beth," but she raised her hand gently, stopping him. "It's okay. I don't say that to hurt you. I think I just needed you to hear it. Because I spent years trying to figure out what kind of person leaves, and what kind of person keeps loving them anyway." Rick looked away, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the portal gun sitting on the counter. The reflection of its green light painted the side of his face. "I left," he said finally, "because I thought I was poison. I figured the best way to protect you was to stay gone." Beth's voice was calm. "And did it work?" Rick gave a small, dry laugh. You tell me." They both smiled at that, a tired, shared kind of smile. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like recognition. After a while, Beth stood up, crossed the small kitchen, and leaned against the counter near him. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think I wanted an apology. Like some big moment where you'd say you were sorry, and everything would fix itself. But I don't think that's what I want anymore. It's just data." That's what I told myself when I made it. Emotional data. Morty let out a shaky laugh through his tears. "Of course you'd call it that," he whispered. Rick's faint image smiled. That same crooked, self-mocking grin Morty knew so well. "Yeah, I had to hide it in science so I could stand recording it." "But you'll know what it really is." The hologram paused. The silence between words was heavy yet warm, like a blanket that remembered the shape of someone who used to sleep under it. "Morty. Don't turn into me. Don't build things just to avoid feeling them. Don't turn the universe into a distraction. There's beauty in sitting still, kid. There's power in staying." The projection flickered, almost fading. Morty panicked, stepping forward. "Wait, Rick, don't—" But then, softly, Rick's final words came through. "If you ever wonder why I kept fixing the portal gun instead of fixing myself, it's because I didn't know how. But I think you might. You always had a better map of the heart than I did. So keep it safe. And if you ever need me—" The hologram looked up directly into Morty's eyes. "You already know where I'll be." Then the light faded. The projection dissolved into tiny particles that drifted upward like dust in sunlight. For a moment, Morty thought he could still see Rick's outline, faint, smiling, watching. The bottle was empty now, but in its hollow shape, there lingered a warmth, a pulse that matched the beating of Morty's own heart. He didn't put the cork back. Instead, he placed the bottle on a small shelf beside the portal gun, next to an old photo of him and Rick at blips and chits, laughing mid-argument. Outside, the night wind moved through the trees. The stars above seemed unusually close, like they were leaning down to listen too. Morty sat on the workbench stool and stayed there for a long time. No words, no plans, just breathing in the silence his grandfather had left behind. When Beth came to check on him hours later, she saw the faint light still glowing from the bottle. She didn't ask what it was. She just smiled sadly and whispered, "He finally said something, didn't he?" Morty nodded, his voice soft and steady. "Yeah, Mom, he did." Beth touched the glass, then turned to leave. As the door closed, Morty looked once more at the bottle, not as a relic, but as a promise. And somewhere, maybe in another timeline, Rick was sitting on a similar workbench, smirking at the irony of it all. In that version, maybe he wasn't alone. The night was long and gentle, the kind that lingered between silence and breath. Outside, the wind had gone quiet. Inside, the house hummed with the small sounds of sleeping people. A refrigerator clicking, her dog sighing in its dream, the low hum of the universe slipping softly past the window. Beth sat in the kitchen with a half-empty cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward and vanish. She wasn't really drinking it. It was something to hold, something warm in her hands. Across from her, Rick sat in the same chair he'd always claimed as his own. Slouched but awake, a shadow of light from the window tracing the curve of his face. For once, there were no tools, no blueprints, no gadgets humming on the table between them, just two mugs and the quiet. Beth didn't know how long they had been sitting like that, 5 minutes or an hour. Time around Rick always felt loose, like it could snap at any moment and rearrange itself. He finally spoke first, voice low and almost uncertain. "Didn't think you'd stay up?" Beth smiled faintly. "Didn't think you'd come home." Rick looked down at his flask, though it stayed unopened beside his hand. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess we both surprise ourselves sometimes." They both chuckled, softly, awkwardly, and then silence filled the space again, comfortable in its own uneasy way. Beth studied him under the dim light. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, not just from age, but from weight. Emotional gravity that even Rick Sanchez couldn't outwit. His eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, carried something she'd never seen there before. a kind of surrender. Not defeat, but quiet honesty. Morty told me about the bottle, she said finally. Rick didn't flinch. He just nodded. Yeah, guess it was time. Beth looked down, tracing her finger along the rim of her mug. I always used to leave notes like that. Half equations, half riddles. When I was a kid, I thought they were secret codes for me to solve. But now... She looked up. Now I think they were the only way you knew how to say what you couldn't. Rick leaned back, exhaling. The faint sound of his breath mingled with the hum of the refrigerator. You're not wrong. Beth let the words linger, soft and fragile, before she continued. You know what I remember most about you leaving? It wasn't the fights. It wasn't Mom crying. It was that no one ever explained why. You just disappeared. And the worst part was, I still defended you. Rick's hand twitched slightly as if he'd been hit. Beth, but she raised her hand gently, stopping him. It's okay. I don't say that to hurt you. I think I just needed you to hear it. Because I spent years trying to figure out what kind of person leaves and what kind of person keeps loving them anyway. Rick looked away, eyes fixed on the faint glow of the portal gun sitting on the counter. The reflection of its green light painted the side of his face. I left, he said finally, because I thought I was poison. I figured the best way to protect you was to stay gone. Beth's voice was calm. And did it work? Rick gave a small, dry laugh. You tell me. They both smiled at that, a tired, shared kind of smile. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something like recognition. After a while, Beth stood up, crossed the small kitchen, and leaned against the counter near him. You know, she said quietly, I used to think I wanted an apology, like some big moment where you'd say you were sorry, and everything would fix itself. But I don't think that's what I want anymore. Rick looked up, one eyebrow raised. Yeah, what do you want then? Beth exhaled slowly. I want to understand you, and I want you to understand me. Not the daughter you remember, but the woman I became without you. Rick stared at her for a long time. Then, in the gentlest tone she had ever heard from him, he said, I think I'd like that. They stood in silence together, the quiet stretching like a soft thread between them. The stars outside flickered faintly through the window, pale reflections caught in Rick's eyes. Beth took her mug, poured what was left of her tea into the sink, and leaned on the counter beside him. You know, Morty's been different lately. Calmer, like something finally settled inside him. Rick smirked faintly. Yeah, kid's tougher than I give him credit for. Beth looked over at him, her tone warm but teasing. He gets that from me, Rick chuckled. Yeah, probably. The sound was small but genuine, and for once not followed by another layer of sarcasm or cynicism. After a moment, Beth reached out and placed her hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it landed like gravity. Rick didn't pull away. His hand was cold, hers warm. A contrast that had existed between them their whole lives. You don't have to fix everything, Dad, she said softly. You just have to stay. Rick blinked slowly, his usual sharpness replaced by something soft, fragile. That's the hardest part, he admitted. Beth smiled. Then maybe that's how you know it's worth doing. For a long while, neither of them said another word. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background, marking time in the quietest way possible. Rick finally broke the silence with a sigh that was almost content. You ever think, he said, maybe the smartest thing I'll ever do is... Nothing, just this? Beth nodded. Yeah, maybe this is what genius looks like after it learns how to rest. Rick laughed quietly. Guess even gods need a nap, especially the tired ones, she replied. The stars shifted slightly outside as clouds drifted past. The kitchen light dimmed, and Rick leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Beth stayed where she was, watching him breathe. Slow, steady, peaceful. It was strange, she thought, how something so small could feel like an entire lifetime being repaired. Before heading upstairs, she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. Good night, Dad. Rick didn't open his eyes. He just murmured, Night, Beth. When she reached the hallway, she turned once more to look at him. The man who had built universes now sat quietly in a small, dimly lit kitchen, still, for the first time in a long time. And maybe, she thought, that was enough. The wind whispered softly through the trees outside, carrying away the last sound of the ticking clock. Somewhere a bottle on the workbench glowed faintly, catching the starlight from the window. Beth smiled. For the first time in years, The house and the people in it felt like home. It was late, that strange hour when the air feels half asleep and the sky forgets what color it's supposed to be. The world had turned quiet again, folding itself softly around the Smith house. Everyone was asleep but two. Rick stood at the back door, his silhouette framed by the faint light of the kitchen behind him. He had that restless look again. Not quite sad, not quite curious, but something in between. The kind of expression a man wears when he's lost count of his regrets. Morty appeared behind him, rubbing his eyes, hair a mess of dreams. "Can't sleep either." Rick turned slightly, his voice low, tired but gentle. "Sleep's for people who aren't haunted by their own brain." Morty managed a small grin. "Yeah, guess that makes two of us." Rick hesitated, then pushed the door open. Cool air drifted in, carrying the smell of grass and distant rain. "Come on," he said quietly. "Walk with me." Morty blinked. "Now?" "It's like 3 a.m. "Exactly," Rick said, stepping outside. "Best time to think. The universe is quieter when everyone's pretending it's gone." Morty followed without another word. The porch creaked beneath their feet as they stepped into the yard. The night stretched wide, painted in shades of blue and silver. Crickets whispered in the grass. Somewhere far away, a car passed on an empty road, its sound fading like a sigh. They walked in silence for a while. No portal guns, no ships, no chaos. Just two shadows moving side by side under the soft shimmer of starlight. Morty shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket. "So, where are we going?" Rick shrugged. "Does it matter?" "Guess not." They walked past the fence down the quiet street, their footsteps barely touching the world. The stars above were bright tonight, scattered and alive. Rick looked up for a moment, then down again, as if afraid they might look back. "You know," he said, his voice rough with something unspoken, "I used to think stars were proof of how small we are. Billions of worlds out there, and none of them give a damn about us." Comforting in a messed-up kind of way. Morty looked up too. "Yeah, I used to think that was sad." Rick chuckled softly. "It is, but maybe that's what makes it beautiful. Every stupid little life trying to mean something in all that noise." They reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood. Empty now, just a playground bathed in pale moonlight. Rick sat down on a swing, the chains groaning under his weight. Morty sat beside him, his swing still and quiet. For a long moment neither spoke. The world around them seemed to breathe, slow, steady, alive. Morty finally broke the silence. "You ever think about the prison?" Rick didn't move. "Every night," Morty hesitated. "When you were gone, I kept dreaming about you, like I'd find you in these weird places. Hallways, labs, even floating in space. You'd always be doing something, building something. But every time I called out, you wouldn't turn around." Rick's grip tightened on the chains of the swing. "That tracks." Morty looked down at the dirt beneath his shoes. "I think I get it now, though. You weren't ignoring me, you just didn't know how to look back." Rick stared straight ahead. The wind brushed through his hair. "Morty, I've done a lot of things that make it hard to look anyone in the eye. Especially you." Morty looked up. His voice was quiet but steady. "I know, but I'm still here, right?" Rick exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I guess you are." The moonlight made everything look softer, even Rick's scars, even the exhaustion in his face. For a second he looked like someone else entirely, not the universe's smartest man, not a broken genius, just a tired grandfather trying to figure out how to be human again. Morty leaned back, his swing creaking gently. "Do you ever feel different since you came back?" Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, but not in the way people think. I didn't come back because I escaped. I came back because I finally stopped running." Morty frowned slightly. "Stopped running from what?" Rick looked up at the stars. "Myself." The air felt thicker after that, like the night had leaned in to listen. Morty didn't say anything, and he didn't have to. Some moments weren't meant to be filled with words. Rick reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver flask. He turned it over in his hand, then passed it to Morty. "You won't like it," he said softly. Morty looked at it, surprised. "You want me to?" Rick shook his head. "No, just hold it. Feels lighter when someone else does." Morty took the flask carefully, feeling the cool metal against his palms. "So, what now?" Rick glanced toward the horizon. The first trace of dawn was just beginning to soften the edge of the world. Now we keep walking. That's all there ever is. They stood up, leaving the swings swaying behind them. The road stretched ahead, washed in the faintest gray light. "Hey, Rick," Morty said after a while. "Yeah? Do you ever think you'll, really be free from everything that happened?" Rick was quiet for a long time before answering. "Still working on it," Morty smiled, nodding. "Yeah, me too." The sound of their footsteps blended with the waking world, birds stirring in trees, the whisper of wind through leaves. It was the kind of morning that didn't rush to arrive, easing into the edges of sleep. Rick stopped at a small rise in the road. The sun was just beginning to touch the sky, painting it in faint gold. He turned to Morty, his expression unreadable. "You know," he said softly, "people think escaping means breaking out of something. But sometimes it's just learning how to stand still without hating what you see." Morty nodded. "Guess you finally did that, huh?" Rick smirked faintly. "Guess we both did." They stood there for a while, watching the light grow. Neither needed to say anything more. When they finally turned back toward the house, the world behind them glowed quietly, the night fading into something like peace. Rick slipped his hands into his pockets, and for the first time in a long while he didn't look tired, just calm. As they reached the yard, Morty looked up at him and said, "Hey, Rick." "Yeah, kid?" "I'm glad you came back." Rick paused at the door, glancing toward the sky one last time. "Yeah, me too, Morty." And then, with a small nod, he opened the door and stepped inside. The morning light followed them in, soft. Forgiving new morning slipped gently into the Smith house, carrying the faint scent of coffee and quiet. The kind of morning that felt fragile, as though one wrong word could make it disappear. The sun climbed slowly across the windows, touching the walls with soft gold. Summer sat alone at the kitchen table, stirring a bowl of cereal she wasn't eating. The spoon moved in slow circles, chasing thoughts instead of milk. She'd been awake since dawn, long before the house began to stir, listening to the sounds of a world trying to remember how to feel normal again. When Rick and Morty walked in from the backyard, the light caught them in a strange way. Morty looked peaceful for once. Rick looked different. Not happy, not fixed, but quieter, like something heavy had shifted inside him. Summer looked up, her eyes sharp and searching. "You two go on a field trip or something?" Rick raised an eyebrow, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Just a walk." "Universe still there, in case you're wondering." "Didn't ask," Summer said flatly, though the corner of her mouth twitched. Morty dropped into a chair beside her, hair a mess, shoes muddy. "We, just needed to clear our heads," Summer smirked. "Since when do you and Grandpa Rick clear your heads without blowing something up?" Rick poured his coffee, ignoring her tone. "Since now." That quiet answer made her pause. She looked at him, really looked. There was something strange about him this morning. Less armor, less edge, like a storm that had finally decided to stop fighting itself. Beth entered next, tying her robe tighter. "Morning. You two were out early. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Rick said simply, sitting down. "Everything's fine." Beth frowned, not buying it, but let it go. She reached for the kettle and started her own routine. Water, cup, silence. Summer leaned on her elbow, eyes drifting to Rick again. "So, are we going to pretend nothing's been weird lately, or should we actually talk about it?" Rick took a long sip of his coffee. "Define weird." "Oh, I don't know," Summer said, her tone cutting but calm. "You getting kidnapped by intergalactic cops? Escaping like some cosmic outlaw and then pretending everything's cool? That kind of weird." Morty shifted uncomfortably. "Summer." She held up a hand. "No, it's fine. Someone should say it." Rick set his cup down. "If you're expecting an apology for existing, you'll be waiting a while." Summer met his eyes. Not an apology. Just honesty. Something in her voice cracked slightly. Not anger, not sarcasm, but something closer to hurt. She'd spent the whole time he was gone pretending she didn't care. Now that he was back, pretending was harder. Rick leaned back, his expression unreadable. "What do you want me to say, Summer? How about I scared you all? Or I shouldn't have left without a word? Or maybe just, I missed you." The room went still. Beth froze mid-motion. Morty stared at the table. Even the ticking clock seemed to stop for a second. Rick looked down at his hands. The silence stretched until it began to ache. Finally, in a voice so quiet it almost wasn't his, he said, I did. Summer blinked. What? Rick's eyes didn't move from the table. I missed you. All of you. Didn't think I would, but turns out that's another thing I was wrong about. The words hung in the air like fragile glass. Unexpected, impossible, real. Beth turned slightly, her face softening. Morty smiled faintly, a quiet relief flickering behind his tired eyes. Summer didn't speak right away. Her throat felt tight, her sarcasm fading. Well, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Took you long enough. Rick smirked faintly. You're welcome. The tension eased. Morty laughed under his breath, and even Beth smiled, small but genuine. Later that afternoon, the house was quieter. Rick disappeared into the garage as usual, tinkering with something no one could understand. Morty was upstairs, probably replaying the morning in his head. Summer wandered outside, standing in the yard where the grass still held the memory of their footprints from the night before. The sun was bright, the air soft with spring. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in, that rare, delicate sense of peace that came when no one was looking for it. Then, from behind her, a familiar voice. If you're gonna steal my air, at least make it worth it. Summer turned to see Rick leaning on the porch railing, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. You always sneak up like that? She asked. Occupational hazard, Rick replied. What are you doing out here? Thinking. Dangerous habit, she smiled faintly. Guess it runs in the family. Rick walked over and stood beside her, looking out across the yard. How you were right, you know. Summer frowned. About what? About pretending everything's fine. It's not. She looked at him, surprised. So, what now? Rick's gaze stayed on the horizon. Now we stop pretending. And maybe start trying. Summer crossed her arms, half skeptical. Trying what? Rick shrugged. Being a family, whatever that means. For a man who could rewrite galaxies, the sentence sounded strangely vulnerable. Summer studied him for a long moment, then said softly, That's new. Rick grinned slightly. Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my brand. She laughed, and really laughed, for the first time in weeks. The sound felt good, like sunlight finding its way through clouds. Rick watched her and smiled quietly. It was small and fleeting, but it was there, real and human. Hey, Summer began, glancing toward the house. You think things will ever go back to normal? Rick took a deep breath. No, but maybe they'll go forward. They stood there together, watching the light shift across the lawn. No cosmic adventures, no explosions, no portals. Just two people learning how to exist in the same quiet space again. Beth's voice called from inside. Dinner ready. The kind of normal that had always felt temporary in this house. Rick started to turn, then stopped. Summer, yeah? You've got your mom's brain, he said. And your own stubbornness. Don't waste either, she raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? Rick smirked. Don't get used to it. Summer rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. Come on, old man. Dinner. Rick followed her toward the house, the sound of their footsteps blending with the hum of the evening. Inside, the table was already set. Morty was talking about some science fair thing. Beth was listening. For once, no one was yelling. No one was walking away. Rick paused at the doorway, looking at them, the family he'd nearly lost. The chaos he called home, and then quietly, he joined them. The laughter came slowly at first, awkward but warm. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, it felt almost natural again. Summer caught Rick's eye across the table and smiled, small, secret, and real. Rick didn't say anything. He didn't have to. For the first time in a long time, the silence between them meant peace, not distance. Night settled softly over the Smith house. The air was cool, the stars sharp and clear like scattered glass. Morty couldn't sleep, not really. The house had grown too still lately, like the universe itself was holding its breath. He lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, thinking about how everything had changed since Rick came home. It wasn't loud anymore. No explosions, no manic laughter, no wild experiments at 3 in the morning. Just quiet. Too quiet, he missed it, and yet, maybe quiet was what Rick needed. Maybe it was what they all needed. The faint hum of the garage light blinked through Morty's curtains, a pulse of yellow that came and went like a heartbeat. He got up, slipped on his hoodie, and padded down the hall. The night felt weightless, like walking through a dream. When he opened the garage door, The smell of metal and ozone greeted him, a scent that meant home in a strange, chaotic way. Rick was there, of course, sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by tools and half-built gadgets. No music, no muttering, just a quiet rhythm of thought. Couldn't sleep? Rick asked without looking up. Morty shrugged. Yeah, you? Rick grunted. Sleep's for people without regrets. Morty smiled faintly. That's kinda dark. Rick finally looked up, one eyebrow raised. Everything worth saying usually is. There was no sharpness in his tone tonight, just a tired sort of honesty, the kind that didn't need to be defended. Morty hesitated. You are working on something? Rick nodded toward the glowing circle of the portal gun on the table. Fixing, adjusting, simplifying, haven't been anywhere in a while. Thought maybe one last trip. One last trip? Don't get sentimental, Morty. Not that kind of last, just something different. Rick stood, brushed off his hands, and pointed the gun toward the floor. A quiet hum filled the air, lower, softer than usual. The portal that bloomed wasn't green this time. It shimmered in slow waves of blue and white, like light moving underwater. Morty stared. That's new. Rick gave a small smirk. Made some improvements. Lower energy output, cleaner dimensional boundaries, and less chance of us dying horribly? Morty finished. Rick chuckled softly. That too. He gestured toward the portal. Come on, Morty, I want to show you something. Morty hesitated only a second before stepping through. The transition was different this time. Smoother, quieter. Instead of the usual chaos of swirling voids and shifting gravity, he felt like he was drifting through mist. When they emerged, the first thing he noticed was the light. It was everywhere, a soft, luminous glow that pulsed gently, almost in rhythm with his own heartbeat. They stood on a smooth expanse of white sand that curved infinitely in all directions. Above them, the sky shimmered, not black, not blue, but alive. It expanded and contracted, like lungs inhaling and exhaling across the cosmos. Morty whispered, What is this place? Rick stood beside him, eyes half closed, listening. This, Morty, is a living world. A planet that breathes, Morty frowned. Like, actually? Rick nodded slowly. The whole biosphere functions like a single organism. It inhales cosmic radiation, exhales energy. Every pulse you see up there, that's the world's heartbeat. Morty looked up again, mesmerized. The stars seemed to move with the breath, twinkling in sync with the invisible rhythm. Each inhalation deepened the color of the sky. Each exhalation released faint trails of light that fell like soft rain. It was beautiful, impossibly so. Rick sat down on the sand, folding his legs like a monk. Sit, listen, Morty followed. The ground was warm, humming faintly under his palms. The sound wasn't exactly sound, more like a feeling, a deep vibration that wrapped around the bones, syncing with his pulse. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of the horizon, breathing like some great sleeping creature. Morty whispered, It feels alive. Rick nodded. Everything is if you pay enough attention. Morty turned to him. You've been here before? Rick's eyes stayed on the sky. Once, a long time ago. I came here trying to understand how it worked, what force made it pulse. Thought maybe I could use it, bottle it, turn it into some new kind of power source. And did you? Rick shook his head. No, I got drunk, fell asleep on that ridge over there, and woke up realizing not everything's meant to be used. Morty was quiet for a moment. So why bring me here now? Rick exhaled softly. Because I forgot how to listen. Thought maybe you could remind me. Morty smiled, unsure if it was a joke or not. Me? Remind you? Rick didn't look at him. You see things I stopped seeing a long time ago, Morty. The small stuff. The good stuff. The kind of things that don't show up in equations. Morty looked back at the breathing sky. It's weird. It almost feels like it's breathing with me. Rick gave a quiet laugh. Maybe it is. They sat in silence again, the kind that didn't need to be filled. The longer they watched, the slower the world seemed to move. The breath of the planet syncing perfectly with their own. Morty finally whispered, You think the universe does this too? Like, breathes? Rick's eyes softened. Yeah, in its own way. Expands contracts, creates, destroys. Every breath a new beginning. Morty thought about that for a while. So, when you were in prison, did you feel this? Rick's face darkened slightly, but not with anger. No, the opposite. Every breath there felt like it was borrowed. Morty nodded quietly. Guess that's why it's good you're here now. Rick gave a faint smile. Guess so. They stayed until the horizon began to glow, not with a sunrise but with something stranger. A slow ripple of color rolled through the sand, illuminating every grain like a sea of tiny stars. Rick stood and stretched, his movements slow, unhurried. Time to head back. Morty looked disappointed. Already? Rick glanced at him. The universe doesn't stop breathing, Morty. You can always come back and listen again. He activated the portal, and the blue light shimmered open. As they stepped through, Morty looked back one last time. The world exhaled, sending a faint breeze through his hair. Warm, almost affectionate. Back in the garage, the hum of machines felt almost alien after that silence. Rick placed the portal gun down carefully, like setting aside something sacred. Morty whispered, "It's weird. It's like I can still feel it breathing." Rick looked at him, eyes soft. "That's the point, Morty. You're supposed to." They stood there a while longer, just listening to the faint ticking of the lights, the low hum of the world outside. For once there was nothing to fix, nothing to chase, nothing to escape, only breath, only the universe moving quietly through them both. And in that small, fragile piece, Rick finally looked at ease. The morning after their quiet return from the breathing world, the garage smelled faintly of solder and coffee. Sunlight crept through the window blinds like thin golden ribbons, striping across Rick's workbench. He sat there motionless, eyes half open, as if caught between two worlds, the one outside and the one inside his head. Morty found him like that, same as he had many mornings before. But something felt different today. Rick wasn't tinkering. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't even pretending to think. He was just still. Morty stood in the doorway, unsure whether to speak. The soft hum of the machines filled the silence like breathing. Rick finally said, "You ever notice, Morty, how everything that matters always finds a way to leave?" Morty frowned. "I mean, that's kind of depressing, Rick." Rick's mouth twitched. "Yeah, but it's also true." He turned one of his old portal discs in his hand, dull now, its edges scratched and fading. "I used to think freedom meant having infinite options, infinite doors. But the more of them I opened, the less any of them led anywhere that mattered." Morty stepped closer. "So, what are you saying?" Rick sighed. "I'm saying maybe the real trick isn't finding a way out. It's learning how to stay." For a while, neither spoke. The garage lights flickered softly, reflecting in the thin puddle of oil beneath the workbench. It shimmered like a black mirror. Morty said quietly, "You're not thinking of leaving again, are you?" Rick glanced at him. Not sharp, not dismissive, just tired. "No, Morty, I'm thinking of stopping." "Stopping what?" Rick looked down at the portal disc again, turning it between his fingers. "Everything running, building, fixing things that don't want to be fixed." Morty blinked. "You mean, you're done with science?" Rick let out a dry chuckle. "No one's ever done with science, but maybe I'm done using it to run from things." He set the disc down and reached for a small holographic console on the wall. A soft blue light spread through the garage, illuminating rows and rows of floating portal coordinates. Each one pulsed faintly, thousands of worlds, countless escapes, infinite possibilities. Morty stared. You kept all of them?" "Yeah," Rick's voice was quiet. "Every world I've ever been to. Every mistake I didn't want to face again." He reached up and hovered his finger over the panel. "You know what happens when you collect too many exits, Morty?" Morty shook his head. "You stop noticing which door leads home." Rick pressed a button. The screen flickered. One by one, the glowing coordinates began to blink out. Tiny stars extinguishing in a vast blue night. Morty's eyes widened. "Wait, Rick, what are you—" Rick interrupted softly. "Deleting them. All of them. Every escape route, every alternate reality, every stupid reset button I ever built." The light dimmed with each deletion, the room growing darker until only one coordinate remained, the one marked home. Morty felt something tighten in his chest. "You really mean it, huh?" Rick didn't answer right away. He looked at the final glowing symbol. A simple line of code, but one that pulsed with a strange warmth. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I do." The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't empty, it was whole. Morty sat down beside him. You know, Rick, I used to think you'd never stop running. I mean, I get it. You've seen everything, done everything. But maybe you don't have to anymore, Rick smirked. Look at you, Morty. Dropping Hallmark wisdom like you're the one with gray hair. Morty grinned. Someone's got to balance out the cynicism. Rick laughed, a real soft laugh. The kind Morty hadn't heard in a long time. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Birds, or something like them, chirped faintly from a distance. The air felt clearer. Rick leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. You know what's funny, Morty? I used to think that freedom was about having no attachments. Turns out it's the attachments that keep you free. Morty frowned. That's backwards, Rick nodded. Exactly. He stood up, walked to the garage door and opened it. The light spilled in, warm and golden. The grass outside glistened with dew. Everything smelled faintly of rain. Morty followed him out. So what now? Rick shoved his hands in his lab coat pockets. Now? I think I'm going to take a nap. Morty laughed. Seriously? Morty, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is rest. They walked together down the driveway. For once there was no rush, no alarm, no distant explosion waiting to interrupt, just the sound of wind in the trees and the quiet hum of the world turning. Morty kicked a small pebble. It's weird. Feels like the end of something. Rick nodded slowly. Maybe, but endings are just points on a curve. You zoom out far enough and everything's circular. Morty thought about that as they reached the street. So, we'll keep going? Rick looked at him. Not as a student, not as a burden, but as an equal. We'll keep breathing, Morty, that's enough. They walked a bit farther, then stopped by the mailbox. Rick reached inside his coat and pulled out his flask. He looked at it for a long moment before setting it down gently on the curb. Morty blinked. You're just going to leave it there? Rick shrugged. Yeah, some things don't need to follow you home. A quiet breeze passed through, lifting a few strands of his hair. For a brief moment he looked younger. Not because of his face, but because of the stillness behind it. Morty whispered, You think things will ever be normal? Rick's smile was almost invisible. This is normal, Morty, for us anyway. They turned back toward the house. The garage door was still open, light spilling out like a soft heartbeat. Rick paused, looking at it one last time. He didn't need to say anything. Morty didn't either. The moment said it for them. The long, slow goodbye that wasn't really goodbye at all. As they stepped inside, the shadows of morning stretched quietly across the floor, and somewhere, deep in the corner of the garage, the last portal coordinate, home, pulsed once more, then faded into the air like a sigh. The world exhaled with them.